with their skulls placed between their feet. Because surviving isn't about guns. Actual historical records of mass corpse burnings. Dead can return. Golden age of zombies. Before zombies roamed movie screens, they walked among the living in real history. Before zombies became a pop culture obsession. Before the living dead clawed their way through horror movies and video games. The fear of the reanimated dead was already deeply ingrained in human history. Ancient civilizations spoke of the dead returning, not as mindless creatures, but as tormented spirits, cursed revenants, or even vengeful corpses. These weren't just bedtime stories, they were warnings. To find the first true accounts of the undead, we must look back over 4,000 years, to the cradle of civilization itself. The lands of Mesopotamia, now modern-day Iraq, were home to the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, some of the earliest advanced societies. They built great cities, developed the first writing system, and left behind detailed records of their myths, gods, and their nightmares. In ancient Mesopotamian mythology, death was not the end. The dead could return not just as ghosts, but as something worse. One of the oldest references to the undead appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving works of literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written around 2100 BCE, tells the story of Gilgamesh, a legendary king who embarks on a quest for immortality. But buried within its verses is something chilling. The goddess Ishtar, enraged by Gilgamesh's rejection, threatens to unleash a curse. I will raise up the dead to devour the living, and the dead shall outnumber the living. It is one of the earliest written accounts of a horde of undead rising from the underworld to consume the world of the living. This isn't a vague metaphor. Mesopotamians feared this possibility. They believed the dead could return if injured, mistreated, or disturbed. Archaeologists have uncovered clay tablets dating back thousands of years that reference the Atemu, restless spirits of the dead who wandered the earth. Unlike ghosts, these beings could take physical form, appearing sickly and rotting, their presence bringing disease and misfortune. The Akkadians and Babylonians believed that improper burials, forgotten ancestors, or curses could reanimate the dead. To prevent this, they placed protective spells on tombs and performed elaborate burial rituals to keep the deceased in the underworld. One inscription found in the ruins of Nineveh warns, "Disturb not the dead lest they walk again." The Mesopotamians took extreme measures to keep the dead from returning. Some tombs were sealed with heavy stones, not just to protect from grave robbers, but to prevent the corpses from rising. Corpses were sometimes bound or weighed down. Similar to later European practices of staking vampires, priests would also place small figurines of protective spirits near graves to guard the living from the dead. If a person was suspected of coming back, if their body didn't decay as expected, they were exhumed, ritually destroyed, and then reburied. These ancient fears weren't just myths. They shaped entire civilizations, influencing how they handled their dead and how they understood the afterlife. Long before Hollywood, long before Romero's slow, walking hordes or fast-moving infected, the fear of the dead walking among us was already deeply ingrained in human history. The Mesopotamians believed in the undead. They feared them. And they weren't alone. But this is only the beginning, because as we move through history, the fear of the undead doesn't disappear. It evolves. Imagine the head of a zombie as the subscribe button. Smash it. Ancient Egypt perfected the art of preserving the dead. But what if it wasn't to honor them? What if it was to keep them from coming back? For over 3,000 years, the Egyptian civilization flourished along the Nile, building grand monuments and developing one of the most intricate religious systems in history. They believed in life after death and eternal existence beyond the grave. But with that belief came an unshackable fear. The dead must remain where they belong. Egyptian mythology, burial rituals, and curses were not just about guiding souls to the afterlife. They were also about preventing the dead from returning. Unlike other cultures that feared ghosts or wandering spirits, the Egyptians took it a step further. Some legends spoke of the physically reanimated dead, walking once more, driven by vengeance, unrest, or even divine will. Osiris, the first undead god. The most famous myth of resurrection in Egyptian mythology is the story of Osiris, the god of the afterlife. But his tale is not just about rebirth. It is one of violent death, dismemberment, and unnatural return. Osiris, once the ruler of Egypt, was betrayed and murdered by his jealous brother, Set. His body was hacked into pieces and scattered across the land. His wife, Isis, painstakingly gathered the remains, wrapping them together and breathing life back into him. But Osiris did not return as he once was. He was reborn, but not among the living. His body, despite being whole, was unnatural, preserved, embalmed, no longer belonging to the mortal world. He became the first of the dead to walk again, but he could never return fully to life. Instead, he was condemned to rule the underworld, forever existing in the liminal space between life and death. Osiris was revered, worshipped, and feared, and his story would shape Egypt's relationship with the dead for millennia. The true purpose of mummification. Egyptians perfected the process of mummification, a meticulous ritual designed to preserve the body for the afterlife. But what if this process wasn't just about ensuring passage to the next world? What if it was also about making sure the dead stayed dead? The embalming process involved draining the body of fluids to prevent decomposition, removing internal organs to prevent bloating or movement, binding the body tightly in linen wrappings, restricting movement, placing protective amulets and spells over the corpse as safeguards. To the Egyptians, a death wasn't simply an ending, it was a transition, and transitions were dangerous. If not handled correctly, a soul could become trapped between worlds, a thing neither alive nor fully dead. And if that happened, there was a risk it would rise again against its will. Some texts warned of the Mut, the angry dead who had been improperly buried or denied their journey to the afterlife. Now, these were not mere ghosts. They were described as corporeal, decayed, but still moving, filled with rage toward the living who had failed them. This fear was deeply ingrained in Egyptian funerary practices. Tombs were designed as prisons, sealed with enormous stones and hidden from the world, not just to keep thieves out, but to keep whatever was inside from getting out. Cursed tombs and the undead of Egyptian lore. Egyptian tombs are famous for their curses, warnings carved in stone that threaten death or misfortune to any who disturb the burial site. But these curses were not just superstition. They stemmed from the fear that the dead could return if provoked. Some inscriptions discovered in tomes read, "He who disturbs this tomb shall be consumed by the flames of the underworld. The one who moves this stone shall awaken what lies beneath. May the hands of the dead find you in your sleep." These were not metaphorical threats. Some believed these curses manifested physically, bringing disease, madness, or even reanimation. The fear of tomb robbers was not just that they would steal wealth, but that they might unknowingly release something ancient and unspeakable. Even the famous Pharaoh's curse, linked to the opening of King Tutankhamun's tomb, has eerie ties to this belief. While modern science attributes the deaths of those involved to natural causes, at the time many believed they had awakened something that should have stayed buried. The walking dead of Egypt. Ancient Egyptian texts reference beings called the Akharu, undead entities that rose from their tombs to seek revenge or complete unfinished business. Unlike ghosts, these beings were corporeal, physically able to harm the living. In some stories, a wronged or murdered person could be reanimated, not by divine resurrection, but through anger, unfinished vengeance, or even a dark ritual. Some cults allegedly practiced necromantic rites, calling the dead to serve as enforcers of justice or as weapons against their enemies. Egyptian priests performed rituals to ensure the dead remained undisturbed. They placed protective spells over tombs, conducted purification rites, and, in extreme cases, even mutilated the body to prevent reanimation. Some corpses were found with their hands and feet severed, an unsettling practice that suggests a fear of the dead walking again. The legacy of Egypt's undead mythology. Egypt's obsession with preserving the dead influenced cultures for centuries. The concept of mummies rising from their tombs, seeking vengeance or fulfilling a curse, became a powerful image that still lingers in modern horror. But what if these weren't just myths? What if the ancient Egyptians went to such extreme lengths to bind, seal, and curse their dead because they had already witnessed something unnatural, something walking where it should not? This fear did not die with the pharaohs. It would spread to other civilizations, evolving into new myths, new horrors. The dead, it seemed, would never truly rest. The ancient Greeks and Romans feared the dead, but not just as spirits. They feared that some would claw their way back to the world of the living and never leave. The civilizations of Greece and Rome gave us philosophy, democracy, and architecture that still shape the modern world. But beneath their achievements lay something darker, a deep, unshakable fear of the restless dead. Unlike many cultures that viewed the afterlife as a place of peace, the Greeks and Romans feared what might happen if the dead did not remain in their graves. Their legends tell of those who returned in flesh, not just spirit, bringing curses, madness, and sometimes violence. Necromancy in ancient Greece, raising the wrong spirits. The Greeks were one of the first civilizations to document necromancy, the practice of communicating with the dead. But it was not a simple ritual. It was dangerous, unpredictable, and filled with warnings. The underworld, ruled by Hades, was a place where souls were meant to remain. But through necromantic rites, the dead could be called back. The problem, not all spirits were willing. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus himself performs a dark ritual to summon the dead. He digs a trench, fills it with blood, and calls forth spirits. But what he gets is a chaotic, writhing mass of the dead, all desperate to escape their realm. Some whisper secrets, others lunge forward as if trying to break free from death itself. The Greeks believed that if necromancy was not performed correctly, the dead would not return to their slumber. Some would remain, half alive, half dead, a horror neither the gods nor men could control. This fear led to strict burial rites to ensure that dead never had a reason to return. But even that wasn't always enough. Roman burial practices, keeping the dead from walking, the Romans inherited much of their culture from the Greeks. But their fear of the dead became even more tangible. They believed some corpses could rise again, not as spirits, but as physical revenants. To prevent this, they developed rituals specifically designed to trap the dead in their graves. Nails driven through the body of some Roman graves have been discovered, with heavy iron nails driven through bones or the skull, ensuring that the corpse could never move again. Binding and weighing down corpses, some bodies were tied or wrapped in chains, while others were buried with massive stones placed over their chests. Food and trinkets as distractions to prevent the dead from wandering, Romans often left coins, honey, or small offerings to keep the deceased occupied in the afterlife. These weren't just traditions. They were defensive measures against something the Romans had seen, or at least believed in enough to fear. One of the most chilling discoveries in Roman burial sites is the presence of decapitated skeletons, with their skulls placed between their feet or under heavy objects. The meaning is clear. If the body were to rise, it would be unable to find its head. The legend of the Revenants in Roman writings. The Romans documented cases of revenants, the dead who returned with their bodies intact, hungry for vengeance, justice, or simply to haunt the living. The writer Pliny the Younger recorded stories of haunted homes where physical apparitions appeared, dragging their chains through the night. But other Roman historians, like Livy and Suetonius, wrote of something worse. Bodies found disturbed, claw marks inside coffins, whispers of the dead appearing weeks after burial. The most infamous case comes from a Roman story of a young man named Philinian. She had died tragically, yet days later, she returned to visit her former lover. The man, unaware she was dead, welcomed her, But when her parents saw her, they recognized the impossible. She had been buried days ago, and yet she stood before them, pale, quiet, but unmistakably alive. When the town elders investigated, they opened her tomb and found an empty coffin. Some say the gods were punishing her for an unresolved fate. Others whisper that it was proof that the dead could walk among the living if given the chance. The eternal fear of the restless dead. The Greeks and Romans feared death, but more than that, they feared what came after, and what might return if the proper rites were not followed. The iron nails that weighted corpses, the decapitations, these were not the precautions of people fearing ghosts. They were the precautions of people who feared the dead might rise again, in flesh, with hunger, with vengeance. This was not just myth, it was history, and as we continue through time, we will see that the fear of the undead did not disappear. It only grew stronger. Do you think you'd survive a zombie outbreak? Vote in the comments. In ancient China, if a corpse was left unburied for too long, it wouldn't stay dead. It would rise, and it wouldn't walk. It would hop. China's long and complex history is filled with myths of spirits, demons, and ghosts. But one of the most terrifying figures in Chinese folklore is not a ghost at all. It is something worse, unlike spirits that haunt from the beyond. The Jiangshi, or hopping vampire, was said to be a corpse that reanimated and physically roamed the earth. It did not shuffle like a zombie. It did not float like a ghost. It hopped, stiff and unnatural, arms outstretched, hunting for the living. And if it caught you, it would drain your life force, turning you into one of them. But the legend of the Jiangshi wasn't just a myth. It came from real fears, real historical accounts, and the deeply rooted belief that some corpses, under the wrong conditions, would never rest. How corpses were believed to reanimate if left unburied too long. In ancient China, burial was considered one of the most important duties of the living. A corpse had to be properly buried with the correct rituals in the right place, or else something unnatural could happen. Chinese folklore warned that if a person died suddenly, violently, or with unfinished business, their soul might not be able to move on. But worse than a trapped spirit was a body without a soul, one that still moved, still hunted, still fed. The conditions for a corpse to become a Jiangshi included delayed burial if a body was left out for too long. It might absorb too much energy and reanimate. Improper funeral rites, if burial rituals were not completed, the body could rise in search of what it was missing. A violent or unnatural death, those who died tragically were believed to be at higher risk of returning. Being struck by lightning or absorbing Q, some believed corpses could reanimate if they were hit by lightning or absorbed the life force, Kai, of the land. One of the most terrifying aspects of Jiangshi lore was that these corpses did not decay. While traditional zombies rotted over time, the Jiangshi remained stiff, their skin growing pale, hard, and unyielding like a dried corpse. But why did they hop? Folk tales of hopping corpses draining life force. The Jiangshi's rigid, corpse-like state made it impossible for them to move like a normal person. Their muscles were locked, stiffened by death itself. So instead of walking, they moved by hopping, stiff-legged, unnatural, relentless. Their arms, outstretched, were not reaching for balance. They were reaching for their next victim. Many believe that Jiangshi did not drink blood like European vampires. Instead, they fed on Kai, the life energy of living beings. According to legend, if a Jiangshi touched you, your energy would drain instantly, leaving you weak and paralyzed. If you survived the encounter, you might wither away within days. If you died, you might rise as a Jiangshi yourself. Folk tales told of entire villages plagued by Jiangshi, with people vanishing in the night, only for their bodies to be found days later, drained, lifeless, but untouched by decay. Some stories claimed the Jiangshi could be stopped by mirrors because they reflected their true form, showing them as lifeless husks. Sticky rice, a bizarre but commonly believed method, as it was said to absorb excess yin energy. Taoist talismans, paper charms with sacred inscriptions placed on the forehead to freeze them in place. But these protections weren't always enough, and when a village believed they were dealing with a Jiangshi, they took extreme measures, real historical accounts of villagers burning bodies in fear. Jiangshi legends weren't just ghost stories. There are actual historical records of mass corpse burnings, ordered by fearful villagers who believed the dead were rising. One of the most chilling accounts comes from the Qing dynasty, when entire towns exhumed bodies and set them ablaze to prevent reanimation. The fear was real, and it was strong enough that families sometimes destroyed their own ancestors' corpses just to ensure they would never return. Some villagers even hired special Taoist priests, known as corpse herders, who performed rituals to keep Jiangshi from forming, or in some cases, to transport bodies safely across distances without reanimation. And yet stories persisted. The idea of reanimated, hopping corpses spread so deeply into Chinese culture that it lasted for centuries. Even today, the Jiangshi remains one of the most enduring horror figures in Asian folklore, its influence appearing in books, movies, and nightmares. The Vikings believed the dead could rise, but they weren't slow, rotting corpses. They were warriors, stronger than they were in life, filled with rage, and nearly impossible to kill. When people think of the Vikings, they imagine longships, warriors, and epic battles. But what they often forget is that the Norse believed in something darker, something terrifying that lurked beneath their burial mounds. The Raugr, not a ghost, not a mindless corpse, but a flesh and blood revenant stronger than any man, filled with rage and hunger, and nearly indestructible. In Viking legend, some warriors refused to stay dead, whether because of unfinished battles, greed, or sheer hatred. They clawed their way back from the grave, not as men, but as Raugr. And when they rose, they did not just haunt the living. They crushed them, tore them apart, drowned them in their own homes. The Vikings feared nothing, except the dead who refused to stay buried. The Norse belief in the Raugr, warriors who refused to stay dead. The Norse believed that death was not the end. Warriors who died in battle could go to Valhalla, while others might dwell in hell or other afterlife realms. But some refused to go anywhere. A Raugr was not a ghost. It was a corpse that rose from its grave, fully intact, as strong as or even stronger than in life. What made someone become a Raugr? A warrior with an unstoppable will, one who refused to accept death, a person obsessed with their wealth, unwilling to leave it behind, the unburied dead, those whose bodies had not been properly laid to rest. A violent or dishonorable death, creating rage so powerful that the corpse could not rest. Unlike mindless zombies, Raugr retained their intelligence. They knew who they were, they knew what they wanted, and they were almost always driven by hate, hunger, or revenge. But that wasn't the worst part. The Raugr could grow, expand, swell in size. Some stories describe them growing to massive proportions, their bodies stretching unnaturally, their strength becoming inhuman. If one attacked, no normal man could hope to stop it. The eerie stories of grave guardians that crushed the living. Raugr didn't just rise randomly. Some remained buried in their mounds, guarding their treasures, waiting for the foolish to come too close. One of the most chilling stories comes from the saga of Grettir the Strong. A farmer's land was cursed. His livestock was found slaughtered, crushed as if by massive hands. When the farmer investigated, he discovered the grave of a Viking warrior named Gothic, a man who had died violently and was rumored to have returned. Grettir, a legendary warrior, was sent to stop him. When Grettir faced Gothic, the Raugr rose to full height, massive and unnatural, its corpse glowing with an eerie blue light. The fight was brutal. Grettir barely survived, managing to sever Gotthic's head. But before the Raugr finally died, it cursed Grettir, ensuring that he would live the rest of his life in fear and misery. This was the true horror of the Raugr. They weren't just monsters to be slain. They could curse the living, dragging them into despair even in death. and they weren't the only ones. Other sagas speak of Raugr crushing men to death, dragging victims into their graves, or even riding their horses through villages, slaughtering all in their path. The only way to stop them: extreme measures. Rituals the Vikings performed to prevent Raugr from rising. The Vikings feared Raugr so much that they had specific rituals to make sure their dead stayed dead. Some of these methods included bending the dead. Some bodies were tied up or pinned down with stakes to prevent them from rising. Placing heavy stones on graves, large stones were put over burial sites to physically trap the corpse inside. Decapitation: if someone was suspected of being a potential Raugr, their head was removed and placed between their legs, a common tactic seen in multiple ancient cultures. Burning the body: this was the last resort. If a Raugr could not be stopped, its body was burned to ash, ensuring it could never rise again. Driving a sword through the chest: a Viking warrior suspected of becoming a Raugr might be stabbed through the heart while still in their grave, just in case. The Vikings were warriors, raiders, and conquerors. They didn't fear battle. They didn't fear gods, but they feared the Raugr, because while they could fight the living, they had no way to truly defeat the dead. And as we move through history, we will see that this fear of the undead rising from their graves never disappeared. It only evolved. When the Black Death swept across Europe, people feared more than just the disease. They feared the dead rising to spread it further. Throughout history, plague and death have always walked hand in hand. But during the Middle Ages, something even more terrifying lurked in the shadows of mass graves and plague-ridden villages: the belief that the dead did not stay dead. Legends spread of corpses rising from their graves, walking the streets in tattered burial shrouds, bringing disease, curses, and horror to anyone who crossed their path. Some claimed these were just stories, wild tales told by those desperate for an explanation for the relentless waves of death. But others believed they had seen them firsthand. Gravediggers reported hearing movement underground. Bodies that had been buried days before were found disturbed, dislodged, as if they had tried to claw their way out. Some villagers swore they had seen former neighbors wandering the roads at night, their skin pale, their eyes empty, looking for something or someone to take with them. And in some places, zombie hunts were organized, because if the plague didn't kill you, the dead might. European legends of the dead returning to spread disease. The idea of revenants, restless dead who came back to haunt the living, was not new. Many cultures had similar stories, but during the Middle Ages, something changed. People did not just fear spirits or demons. They feared physical, walking corpses. And in many cases, these revenants were linked directly to plagues. During outbreaks of disease, entire villages were wiped out overnight. The cause was invisible. No one knew how sickness spread, but one thing was certain: where the dead piled up, death followed. Stories emerged of plague victims returning from their graves, still infected, still carrying death with them. Some of these legends described revenants visiting their former homes, bringing disease and killing loved ones, corpses moaning in their graves, as if still alive, still suffering, the dead rising to strangle the living, sometimes their own family members. For many, these were not just myths, they were warnings. Warnings that if the dead were not properly buried, if their bodies were not dealt with correctly, they might return. And in some places, that fear led to something truly disturbing: organized hunts for the undead. The Black Death and real accounts of grave robbers fearing reanimated bodies. The Black Death, the most devastating pandemic in human history, killed nearly half of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351. With so many bodies, traditional burial rituals collapsed. Mass graves became common. Corpses were dumped by the dozens, left to rot, covered hastily with dirt. But those who handled the bodies, the grave diggers, the plague doctors, the robbers who looted corpses, began to tell horrifying stories. They claimed bodies twitched after death, a sign, they believed, that the soul had not left the corpse. Groans and whispers came from mass graves, leading to rumors that some had been buried alive, or that the dead had woken up. Some bodies appear to have moved inside their graves, scratches on coffin lids, corpses twisted unnaturally. Today, we know some of these reports may have been caused by post-mortem muscle contractions, trapped air escaping from bodies, or misinterpretation of decomposition effects. But to those who witnessed it firsthand, it was proof the dead could rise, and soon, desperate towns and villages took drastic action. The first historical zombie hunts. Fearing that plague victims were returning from the grave, some towns took extreme measures. Historical records show that during the Black Death, villagers would sometimes exhume bodies suspected of being revenants and destroy them to prevent further death. The methods were brutal, staking corpses through the heart, pinning them down so they couldn't rise. Decapitation. Removing the head to sever the connection to the body, burning the bodies, reducing them to ash so nothing remained. In some cases, entire graveyards were disturbed, as villagers dug up suspected revenants and performed rituals to make sure they stayed dead. One of the most chilling examples comes from medieval Poland, where archaeologists uncovered vampire burials, bodies buried with sickles across their throats or heavy stones placed on their chests. Why? Because people feared these corpses would rise again. These zombie hunts were acts of desperation. They were not just hunting myths or legends, they were hunting what they believed were real, physical undead. And as the centuries passed, these fears did not vanish. They evolved. The idea of the dead walking, spreading disease, bringing destruction would never truly die. It would only change form. And in our next Incurable, we will see how these fears took shape in Haitian folklore, the birthplace of the modern zombie. Before Hollywood turned zombies into flesh-eating monsters, they were real, enslaved by dark magic and forced to walk the earth. Zombies did not begin in horror movies. They did not start with the living dead hunting for brains. The origins of the modern zombie trace back to a place where the dead were for an entirely different reason: Haiti. Here, zombies were not mindless monsters. They were prisoners, bound by Vodou magic, stripped of their free will, and forced into endless servitude, a fate worse than death. And for those who believed, the terror was not in becoming a victim of the undead. The terror was in becoming one, the infamous practice of turning people into the undead through dark magic. In Haitian folklore, a zombie is spelled without this was not a rotting corpse hungry for human flesh. It was a person. Someone had been killed, buried, and then brought back, not as themselves, but as a soulless servant. The power behind this horrifying transformation, Vodou. More specifically, the work of a Raugr, a Vodou sorcerer with the ability to raise the dead and control them completely. Unlike Vodou priests, who performed spiritual rituals to heal and connect with ancestors, the Raugr practiced dark magic, destructive, manipulative, and terrifying. The process of creating a zombie was said to involve a powerful poison, often derived from pufferfish toxins, capable of inducing a death-like state. Burial while still alive, trapped unable to move, the victim was left to die, a resurrection ritual. After a time, the Raugr would dig up the body and use a secret potion to awaken the victim, mind control. The zombie, confused and weak, would believe they had truly died and return to life under the Raugr's will. At this point, the person was no longer considered human. They had no memory of their past life, no thoughts of their own, no emotions. They became a tool used for labor, crime, or revenge. A body without a soul. To the Haitian people, this was one of the most horrifying fates imaginable, because to die was one thing. To die and still not be free, that was worse. Historical accounts of Haitian slaves being brought back from the grave. The roots of the zombie legend are deeply tied to Haiti's brutal history. For centuries, Haiti was one of the largest hubs of the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans were brought to the island, forced to work under inhuman conditions, tortured, and treated as nothing more than property. Many sought escape. Some resisted, some rebelled, and others turned to Vodou. Vodou became more than just a religion. It was a form of resistance, a connection to their ancestors, and a source of power in a world that tried to break them. And within this belief system, the zombie became the ultimate nightmare. To those enslaved, death was not the worst thing that could happen. Death, at least, meant freedom from suffering. But to become a zombie, that meant even death would not save you. Stories spread of cruel masters who worked their slaves to the brink of death, only to have them return as zombies, forced to continue laboring even after their bodies had given out. For the enslaved people of Haiti, this fear was deeply real. And even after Haiti won its independence in 1804, the legend did not disappear. Because while slavery as an institution ended, fear of losing control, of being robbed of your soul, of being trapped inside a body with no freedom, never faded. And the ones who made that fear a reality, the Boker. The Boker and their terrifying control over the dead. If zombies existed, then the Boker were the ones who controlled them. A Boker was a powerful Vodou sorcerer, feared and respected, believed to be capable of performing both miracles and curses. While Vodou priests communicated with spirits and ancestors, Bokers dealt in darker forces. Their role in zombie folklore was clear. They could turn a living person into a zombie, robbing them of their soul. They could reanimate the dead, bringing them back as servants. They could trap spirits in bottles or charms, ensuring that a soul could never move on. Some historical accounts suggest that Bokers had real methods of making people appear dead, using poisons that slowed the heart to near death, allowing them to later resurrect the victim into servitude. To those who witnessed it, this was not just superstition. It was a terrifying reality. There were even reports of families guarding the graves of their loved ones for days after burial, making sure no Boker came to steal the body. Others took drastic measures. Some people were buried face down, so if they were resurrected, they would dig the wrong way and stay trapped. Some bodies were disfigured or burned to ensure they could not be brought back. And in extreme cases, the heads were removed because a zombie with no head was useless to the Boker. For generations, the fear of becoming a zombie remained as strong as the fear of death itself. And while modern science explains many of these stories as cases of poisoning, hypnosis, or cultural fear, one thing remains true. The idea of the undead servant, the body without a soul, would never go away. Instead, it would evolve. And in our next interval, we will see how Western culture twisted the Haitian zombie into something entirely different, something monstrous. Before zombies craved human flesh, there was something far older, a creature that walked the frozen wilderness, cursed with hunger that could never be satisfied. The idea of a walking corpse, cursed to consume human flesh, is not new. Long before Hollywood's zombies shuffled across the screen, long before Haiti's Vodou sorcerers enslaved the dead, there was a legend whispered across the icy forests of North America. A legend of a monster that had once been human, but was now something else entirely. Something cursed, something insatiable. The Wendigo. It did not rot like a zombie. It did not serve a master like a Vodou zombie, but it shared something terrifying with them. It had lost its humanity, and it would never stop hungering for flesh. The Wendigo, an undead being driven by an insatiable hunger. The Wendigo is one of the most dreaded creatures in Algonquin mythology. For centuries, indigenous tribes of the Great Lakes region, the northeastern United States, and parts of Canada have told stories of the Wendigo, a terrifying figure that was once human, but was no longer. What was the Wendigo? It was a being that had once been a person, but something had gone horribly wrong. Some say it was a spirit, others say it was a cursed human, transformed after committing the ultimate sin, cannibalism. According to legend, the Wendigo was created when someone, in the depths of winter starvation, ate human flesh to survive. That single act, consuming another person, was enough to bring on a horrific transformation. their body would change, their soul would rot away, and in its place, an endless, monstrous hunger. But no matter how much flesh the Wendigo ate, it could never be satisfied. And that is what made it so terrifying. It would continue to eat, to hunt, to consume, but it would never be full. The more it ate, the hungrier it became. Like a walking corpse, doomed to wander forever in search of its next meal. The Algonquin myths of humans turning into flesh, eating monsters. The Wendigo was not just a scary story told around campfires. To the indigenous tribes of the north, it was a very real warning. Surviving the brutal winters in these regions was never guaranteed. When food ran out, when starvation loomed, some people were faced with an impossible choice: die or eat the dead. But the legends made one thing clear. If you chose to eat human flesh, you might survive the winter, but you would never be human again. Many versions of the myth described how those who resorted to cannibalism would begin to change, physically and mentally. Their bodies would stretch, growing tall, emaciated with skin stretched too tight over their bones. Their eyes would sink deep into their skulls, hollow and lifeless. Their mouths would grow unnaturally wide, as if their body was reshaping itself to consume more flesh. And worst of all, their soul would be lost forever. They would become a Wendigo, a cursed creature, damned to hunt and feed on the living for eternity. Even if they ate an entire village, their hunger would only grow stronger. And so, the myths served as a warning. No matter how desperate you are, never eat human flesh. Because once you cross that line, there is no going back. Parallels to modern zombies, mindless, insatiable, cursed. The similarities between the Wendigo and modern zombies are impossible to ignore. Both are cursed beings, once human, but no longer. Both have an insatiable hunger for flesh, and perhaps most terrifyingly, both represent a fate worse than death. For centuries, cultures around the world have feared the idea of losing control, of becoming something monstrous and mindless. The Vodou zombie was feared because it had no free will, enslaved by a dark master. The modern zombie is feared because it has no thoughts, just a body driven by hunger. The Wendigo is feared because it has no soul, a being that has lost everything to its own monstrous cravings. But there is one key difference. A zombie is created by an external force, a sorcerer, a virus, a curse. A Wendigo is created by a person's own choice. It is self-inflicted damnation, a moment of desperation, a single, terrible act. And once it happens, there is no cure, no way to come back. And that is what makes it even more horrifying, because the Wendigo does not just represent death. It represents the fear of losing your own humanity. And in the next interval, we will see how this fear evolved, how the idea of the insatiable undead was taken and twisted into something more monstrous than ever before. Because the next evolution of the zombie would not just hunger for flesh, it would turn hunger into an infection, one that could end the world. What if I told you that throughout history, people have been buried only to wake up? And that some cultures feared the dead so much, they waited days, just in case the corpse came back. Death was never supposed to be something uncertain. When a person was declared dead, that was it. Final. Absolute. But history tells a different story. There have been countless cases of the dead returning, not as supernatural creatures, but as real, breathing people who had been mistaken for corpses. Some woke up in the morgue, surrounded by the dead. Others clawed their way out of graves, the dirt above them loosened just enough for them to escape. And in some horrifying cases, the body was found too late, scratch marks on the inside of a coffin. A body contorted in its final struggle. A corpsey that was never supposed to be a corpse at all. This wasn't legend. This wasn't fiction. This was real. And the terror of being buried alive shaped entire cultures, giving birth to waiting periods before burial, the invention of safety coffins, and an obsession with the idea that the dead could come back. Early cases of people being declared dead and coming back. Throughout history, medical knowledge was imperfect at best. There were no heart monitors, no EEG scans, no modern technology to confirm if a person was truly dead. Doctors relied on the absence of breath, pulse, and movement, and sometimes that wasn't enough. Many conditions could mimic death. Catalepsy, a state of complete stillness where the body appears lifeless. Comatose patients who seemed dead but later woke up. Hypothermia, bodies so cold that their heartbeats slowed to near undetectable levels. Shock, sudden trauma that left people unresponsive for long periods. And when these misdiagnosed dead were placed in coffins, crypts, or morgues, some of them woke up. The case of Anne Green. One of the most famous early cases happened in 1650. Anne Green, a young woman in England, was sentenced to death by hanging for what was considered a crime at the time, giving birth to a stillborn child out of wedlock. She was hanged for half an hour, her body swinging lifelessly before being declared dead. She was then given to medical students for dissection. But just as the students prepared to cut into her, something happened, a gasp, a small movement. Then her eyes fluttered open. Anne Green had survived her own execution. Doctors rushed to revive her, and incredibly, she made a full recovery. Because of the laws at the time, her survival was seen as an act of God, and she was pardoned. She lived for years after, a woman who had literally returned from the dead. The morgue resurrections of the 19th century. By the 1800s, cases of the dead returning were still terrifyingly common. One notorious story from France involved a woman who had died of cholera. Her family mourned her, had her body prepared, and sent her to the morgue to be placed among the dead. But when an attendant passed by her body, something caught his eye. A slight twitch of the finger, then a slow rise and fall of her chest. She was still alive. Rushed to care, she eventually made a full recovery. Had she been buried just a few hours earlier, she would have died for real, a victim not of disease, but of a mistake. She wasn't alone. Throughout Europe, medical reports documented dozens of cases of people waking up in morgues, seconds away from autopsies. And so, as these stories spread, something changed. Cultures began to fear burying people too quickly, because what if they weren't really dead? Cultures that held waiting periods before burials. In some places, the fear of premature burial became so widespread that entire cultures created rituals to prevent it. They introduced waiting periods, a time between death and burial. Just to be absolutely sure, the German Leichenhaus, a corpse house. In 19th century Germany, special buildings called Leichenuser corpse houses were created. The dead weren't buried immediately. Instead, their bodies were laid out in these waiting chambers, carefully watched over by attendants. And just in case the body suddenly moved, a string was tied to the corpse's hand, connected to a bell outside. If the dead awoke, they could ring for help. This idea of the waiting dead wasn't unique to Germany. In places like China and India, bodies were often kept in special death rooms before burial. Some cultures placed mirrors in front of the deceased, believing that if a person was truly dead, their reflection would vanish. Even in England, the wealthy began demanding that their burials be delayed for days, or even weeks, just in case. The Victorians took this fear to a whole new level. The Victorian obsession with being buried alive. No era was more obsessed with the horrors of premature burial than the Victorians. For them, death was everywhere. The 19th century was a time of tuberculosis, plagues, and sudden deaths, and the stories of people being buried alive only fueled the paranoia. Newspapers ran articles about graves being opened and revealing scratch marks inside coffins. Doctors admitted that they sometimes made mistakes in declaring people dead. And so the Victorians invented new ways to make sure that no one was buried alive. The safety coffin. One of the most famous inventions was the safety coffin. This was a specially designed coffin that contained a rope or string connected to a bell above ground. If a person woke up underground, they could pull the rope and ring for help. It wasn't just a gimmick. Some wealthy Victorians demanded to be buried in these coffins, terrified of waking up, trapped beneath the earth. Other safety coffins had air tubes, so if a person was buried prematurely, they wouldn't suffocate before being rescued. Some even included a small supply of food and water, just in case. For the Victorians, the fear of waking up in a coffin was very real. And the chilling part, they had every reason to be afraid, because throughout history, there have been cases of graves being reopened, and the bodies inside showing signs of struggle. Bodies with their hands raised, their mouths open in silent screams. Bodies that had turned over, their last movements spent trying to claw their way out. Bodies that were supposed to be dead, but had woken up too late. How this fear shaped the idea of the undead. The idea that the dead could return wasn't always supernatural. It wasn't always about spirits or curses. Sometimes it was about something far more terrifying. A body buried too soon, a grave that shouldn't have been filled, a person who should have lived, but was lost forever beneath the dirt. And as these stories spread, so did the fear of what else might return from the grave. First, it was the worry that a person wasn't really dead. Then, it became something worse. The fear that even if they were dead, they might still find a way back. And in the next interval, we'll see how this fear turned into something even darker. Because the modern zombie myth was about to be born. And it wouldn't just be about people waking up too soon. It would be about the dead refusing to stay dead at all. What if I told you that no matter where you go in the world, every civilization shares one terrifying belief: the dead don't always stay buried. There is a fear so ancient, so universal, that it has transcended language, culture, and time. It doesn't matter where you look, whether in the frozen tundras of the north, the dense jungles of South America, or the sun-scorched deserts of Africa. One belief remains the same: the dead can return. It is a fear so ingrained into human history that it has taken many forms. The Raugr in Norse mythology, warriors who refused to rest in their graves. The Jiangshi of China, hopping corpses that drained the living of their energy. The European Revenants, undead beings feared for spreading disease and terror. The Haitian Vodou zombie, a person whose body was stolen and reanimated. It is no coincidence that these stories exist everywhere, because across history, in every corner of the world, there have been moments when people truly believed they were witnessing the dead rise. Moments of mass panic. Moments where societies feared they were standing at the edge of something unnatural. Moments that spread the fear zombies across continents. The unifying fear of the dead rising. It might seem strange that so many different cultures develop the same fear. But the truth is, this fear wasn't just born from superstition. It came from something much deeper. Something primal. Something human. For as long as civilization has existed, the dead have never truly left the living alone. Decomposing bodies, the spread of disease, the horror of premature burial. For early humans, death was never a peaceful end. It was something to be feared, because sometimes the dead did come back, not as supernatural creatures, but in ways that were just as terrifying. Bodies that twitched and groaned due to post-mortem spasms. Corpses that bled from the mouth as gases built up inside them. Buried bodies that were dug up with signs of struggle, proving they had been alive underground. These real-world horrors made people question, what if the dead weren't truly gone? What if they could rise and walk again? And what if, when they did, they weren't the same as before? Common themes across different civilizations. Though separated by thousands of miles, different cultures all arrived at the same conclusion, that when the dead came back, it wasn't good. Across history, three major themes have remained consistent: the dead return with a purpose. In Norse mythology, the Raugr didn't just wander aimlessly, they had a mission. Some sought revenge, others guarded treasures, and some existed purely to bring suffering. In Japan, the Gaki were spirits of the dead who returned due to unfulfilled hunger, consuming whatever they could find, including human flesh. In early Christian folklore, the Revenants rose because of sins left unpunished, cursing entire villages. The dead are contagious. European plague-era myths claimed that the first revenants didn't just return. They spread disease, infecting others and creating more of their kind. In Africa, some tribes believed the undead could multiply, turning the living into one of them. The Wendigo of North America's indigenous myths passed its curse through hunger. If you consumed human flesh, you risked becoming a monster. The dead must be stopped. In China, if a Jiangshi was suspected, villagers would burn its body or place a mirror before it, believing it couldn't bear to see its own reflection. In Viking culture, to prevent a Raugr from rising, warriors would bind the body and bury it with iron nails. Throughout Europe, graves were often staked, burned, or even filled with stones to ensure the dead could never leave. These beliefs may seem like folklore, but in many cases they were taken as absolute fact. And in some moments of history, entire societies lost control, believing the undead had come for them. The earliest recorded mass panic over the undead, in the year 1725, a horrifying panic broke out across Eastern Europe. It began in Serbia when reports surfaced that the dead were returning. Villagers whispered that a man named Petar Blagojevic had died but had been seen walking through town just days later. He didn't just return, he attacked. According to legend, he came back from the grave to strangle people in their sleep, and soon after 9 more villagers mysteriously died. His wife, terrified, fled the village, refusing to stay near his grave. The rumor spread like wildfire. The villagers were convinced they had a vampire in their midst, what we now recognize as a form of the undead. The Austrian government sent officials to investigate, expecting to find nothing, but what they discovered horrified them. When Petar's grave was opened, his body was disturbingly intact. Blood dripped from his mouth, as if he had just fed. His fingernails looked longer, like claws. His hair had grown past his shoulders. To the terrified villagers, this wasn't decomposition. This was proof. So, they did the only thing they believed could stop him. They staked his body through the heart, watching as fresh blood gushed from the wound. And just to be sure, they burned what remained. To the villagers, they had saved themselves from a true monsters. To historians, this was one of the first recorded mass panics over the undead, one that sparked a wave of similar cases across Europe. For the next century, more and more reports surfaced. The fear of the dead rising had spread, and it wouldn't stop there, because soon, as history marched forward, this fear would evolve. It would no longer be whispered among villages. It would reach the modern world, and what was once folklore would become something else entirely. Something unstoppable, something global, because in the next interval, we step into the modern era of zombies, the era where science, war, and media turned an ancient fear into an undeniable obsession. The fear of the dead never stayed buried. It evolved. Fear has a way of adapting. It mutates, transforms, and embeds itself into different eras, taking on new shapes with every generation. And no fear has been more persistent than the fear of the dead returning. At first, this terror existed only in whispers, passed down through spoken legends, etched into crumbling tombstones, scratched onto ancient scrolls. But as civilization advanced, so did the storytelling of the undead. What once belonged to the realm of spirits and curses became something tangible, physical, undeniable. The undead of myth and folklore. The Raugr, the Jiangshi, the Revenants slowly merged into a single entity, the zombie, and through literature, folklore, and early recorded history, we can trace the exact evolution of this monster, from the first whispered warnings of walking corpses to the earliest written descriptions of true zombies. The fear of reanimated flesh never died. It only grew stronger. How early myths of reanimation shaped folklore. Long before the word zombie existed, people told stories of bodies rising from the grave. And while each culture had its own version, they all shared one common trait. The dead were never fully at rest. For example, ancient Greece, some of the earliest zombie-like creatures appeared in Greek mythology, where necromancy was both feared and practiced. In the Odyssey, Odysseus travels to the underworld and encounters ghostly, restless spirits who thirst for blood to regain their strength. Ancient Egypt, the story of Osiris, the god who was dismembered, put back together, and reanimated, reinforced the idea that the dead could return. But they wouldn't be the same. Egyptian tombs were filled with protective spells to ensure the dead stayed buried. China's Jiangshi legends, before they were written down, the legends of the hopping corpses spread through word of mouth, warning villagers of corpses that drained the living of energy. These stories were so widely believed that people developed superstitions about leaving bodies unburied too long, fearing they would rise. European revenants. In medieval Europe, peasants feared revenants, physical corpses that crawled from their graves at night to torment the living. These stories, often based on real exhumed bodies, led to burial practices like staking, binding, or even beheading corpses before they were buried. These early myths weren't just superstitions, they reflected genuine fears of death, disease, and the unknown. And as these stories spread, they began appearing in written records, creating the first historical zombies, the first written accounts of true zombies. The transition from spoken myth to recorded literature changed the way zombies were perceived. It took them from regional folklore to something that could be studied, analyzed, and feared across generations. Some of the earliest written accounts of the undead include the Epic of Gilgamesh 2100 BCE, the first thread of a zombie army. One of the first mentions of the dead rising in mass comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest surviving works of literature. In this Mesopotamian epic, the goddess Ishtar makes a terrifying threat. If you refuse to open the gates of the underworld for me, I will smash them down myself. I will raise up the dead to eat the living, and the dead will outnumber the living. This passage suggests that even 4,000 years ago, people feared a scenario where the dead overtook the living, a theme that would later define modern zombie stories. The Tibetan Ro Langs, in 9th century CE, the stiff, mindless dead. In ancient Tibetan texts, there are mentions of the Ro Langs, which translates to the risen corpse. Ro Langs were bodies that reanimated, unable to speak or think, moving stiffly because their joints no longer bent. The only way to stop them, crushing their heads or preventing them from moving, sound familiar. This idea of slow, brainless corpses that could only be stopped by physical destruction is one of the earliest precursors to the modern zombie. The Haitian Vodou zombie is 17th to 18th century. The birth of the word zombie. The first true written accounts of zombies appeared in the 1600s and 1700s when European colonists began documenting Haitian Vodou beliefs. They wrote about enslaved people fearing a fate worse than death, that a Bokor sorcerer could steal their bodies, bringing them back as soulless, mindless workers. This was the first time the word zombie appeared in written records, borrowed from African folklore and reshaped by the brutal history of slavery. These early accounts were the final step in the transition from spiritual fears of ghosts and revenants to the physical horror of the walking dead. It was no longer just souls trapped between life and death. It was bodies reanimated against their will. And with this shift, the zombie as we know it was born. The transition from spirits to mindless, physical undead. The biggest change in the zombie myth came when it left the world of spirits and entered the world of flesh. This shift happened over centuries, but three key events solidified it: the scientific revolution, 16th, 18th century. As people began studying the human body, they discovered post-mortem phenomena, muscles twitching after death, gas buildup causing corpses to move. What was once believed to be supernatural was now seen as a physical process, leading to the question, what if the body could be revived, but the person was gone? The fear of premature burial in the 18th, 19th century. The 1700s and 1800s saw a massive paranoia about people being buried alive. Safety coffins with bells were created, waiting periods before burial became common. and people began digging up graves to find scratch marks on the inside of coffins. This fear reinforced the idea that the dead weren't always fully dead, that they could come back, trapped inside a rotting body. The rise of Gothic literature in the 19th century, with novels like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Edgar Allan Poe's The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar. Horror stories shifted from ghostly hauntings to reanimated flesh. These stories asked terrifying questions. What if science could bring back the dead? What if the soul was gone, but the body remained? These fears would pave the way for the zombie's true evolution into what would soon become a staple of modern horror. But that is where the next chapter begins, because in the next interval, we enter the 20th century, the era where zombies left the pages of books and stepped into the world of film, war, and mass media, where the undead weren't just a legend anymore. They became real, and they would never go away again. The Black Death didn't just kill millions, it made people believe the dead were coming back. Plague wasn't just a sickness, it was a curse, a punishment, a sign that something had gone horribly wrong between the living and the dead. And in medieval Europe, where medicine was limited and superstition ruled, the fear of disease quickly twisted into the fear of reanimation. Mass graves filled faster than they could be dug. Bodies were dumped, half buried, and forgotten. But when the earth shifted or the corpses moved, people didn't see natural decay. They saw something rising, something that shouldn't. In the darkness of plague-ridden cities, a terrifying belief spread. The dead weren't staying dead, and the same rotting bodies that filled the streets during the Black Death weren't just spreading diseases. They were coming back for the living. How mass graves fueled tales of the reanimated dead. When the Black Death struck Europe in the 14th century, it wiped out over a third of the population. With so many dying so fast, traditional burials became impossible. Instead of carefully burying their loved ones, people were forced to dump bodies into pits, sometimes hundreds at a time. But that's where the horror began, because plague graves didn't stay undisturbed. When grave diggers returned to old burial sites, they found something horrifying: bodies that had shifted or turned over in their graves. Skeletons with claw marks inside their coffins, as if they had tried to escape. Skulls with broken jaws, as though they had been biting after death. To the people of the time, this wasn't decomposition, this was evidence. Evidence that some of the dead hadn't stayed dead. And so, a horrifying legend took shape, one that still lingers today, the legend of plague revenants. The plague revenants, the first zombie outbreak stories. A revenant was a corpse that rose from its grave, a body that refused to rest, and during the Black Death, tales of plague revenants spread across Europe. They were described as rotting corpses that wandered the streets at night, the source of further disease outbreaks, bodies that could be moving beneath the ground. In some cases, people believed that those who died of the plague weren't just carrying disease, they were carrying a curse, that their bodies were still hungry for life, that they needed to be stopped before they could spread the sickness further. And so, people took drastic action. The gruesome ways villagers tried to stop the undead. Fear has a way of making people desperate. If a town believed a plague victim had returned from the dead, they wouldn't wait for proof. They would go straight to the graveyard and dig them back up. What happened next is recorded in medieval texts and old church records. The vampire jawbreaking ritual. When villagers found a corpse that had shifted, they believed it was trying to feed, so they would shove a brick between its teeth or break its jaw to stop it from biting. This is why archaeologists have discovered skulls with bricks jammed in their mouths in plague graves across Europe, staking the corpse. Some medieval societies believed that a revenant could be pinned down by driving a stake through its heart. This wasn't done to kill a living person, it was to make sure the dead couldn't walk again, beheading the zombie. In extreme cases, villagers would dig up bodies cut off their heads, and place them between their legs to prevent the corpse from seeing where it was going. This was especially common in Eastern Europe, where the fear of the undead led to rituals that later inspired modern vampire and zombie myths. Burning the infected dead. In some parts of Europe, entire mass graves were set on fire, not just to stop the spread of disease, but to destroy anything that might come back. These weren't isolated events. For centuries, villagers across England, Germany, Poland, and Italy carried out these gruesome rituals, driven by a real fear that the dead could rise again. And even though we now understand decay, disease, and burial conditions, the truth is, some of the evidence they found was genuinely disturbing. But because there were real accounts of bodies that shouldn't have moved, real accounts of exhumed bodies that terrified villages. History is full of stories that blur the line between myth and reality. And during the Black Death, some first-hand reports only made the fear of the undead worse. The walking plague victim of Venice. In Venice, Italy, during a devastating plague outbreak, a group of grave diggers opened a recent burial and found something they couldn't explain. Inside the grave was a woman's corpse. Her mouth open, her hands twisted unnaturally. But what terrified them wasn't her position. It was the fact that her burial shroud was torn apart, seemingly from the inside. The diggers believed they had just witnessed proof that the plague victim had woken up after burial. The woman was labeled a strigoi, an undead being known in Eastern European folklore. Her body was immediately exhumed, mutilated, and burned. The moaning graves of England. During the Great Plague of London, there were reports from mass burial pits that villagers could hear low, muffled sounds coming from underground. Some people dismissed it as settling earth, but others believed it was the dead groaning beneath the surface. This fear grew so strong that some graveyards installed listening devices, tubes that led from the surface down into the graves. And in some cases, when they listened, they swore they heard breathing. Many of these stories can be explained by gas buildup, shifting corpses, and medical misdiagnosis, but for people living in medieval times. These weren't scientific phenomena. They were evidence that the undead were real. The connection between disease, outbreaks, and zombie myths. The idea of the plague zombie never really disappeared. Every time a new disease emerged, so did new fears. From the Black Death to cholera, from tuberculosis to Ebola. Outbreaks always fueled rumors that the sick weren't just dying, they were changing. And it wasn't just superstition. Even today, the idea of a virus that could turn the infected into mindless, flesh-hungry monsters is at the core of modern zombie horror. Because while medieval Europe may not have understood medicine, they understood one thing. When the dead start rising, it's already too late. Long before the first zombie movies, Gothic horror writers already feared the dead would return. But not as monsters, as something far worse. The word zombie didn't exist in the 19th century, but the fear of the undead, that was already thriving. Before the walking dead became mindless, flesh-eating creatures, they were something far more unsettling, something deeply rooted in horror, science, and morality. The writers in the Gothic era weren't just terrified of corpses walking again, they were obsessed with it. And long before zombies were the monsters of apocalypse fiction, they were trapped between life and death in the pages of some of the greatest horror literature ever written. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the birth of the undead horror genre. Every zombie story begins with a single, terrifying question: what happens when the dead come back? But in 1818, Mary Shelley asked a far darker question: what happens if we bring them back ourselves? Her novel, Frankenstein, wasn't just a science fiction story, it was one of the earliest explorations of the undead in modern horror. And it changed everything. The first reanimated corpse in fiction. Before Frankenstein, stories of undead creatures mostly belonged to folklore, myths, and superstitions. But Mary Shelley's novel introduced a terrifying idea: a corpse could be resurrected, not by magic, but by science. The undead could think, speak, and suffer instead of being mindless husks. There was something unnatural and deeply horrifying about bringing back what should remain dead. The creature in Frankenstein wasn't a zombie in the modern sense, but he was stitched together from corpses, revived through unnatural means, and rejected by the living world. In many ways, he was the first literary zombie, and Frankenstein's themes, the fear of reanimation, the horror of a body revived against its will, would influence every undead story that came after it. Edgar Allan Poe and the horror of being trapped between life and death. If Mary Shelley gave us the first reanimated corpse, then Edgar Allan Poe gave us the most terrifying version of it. Poe wasn't just a horror writer, he was obsessed with death, and one of his greatest fears became one of his most disturbing stories. The facts in the case of M. Valdemar. The horror of a conscious, undead mind. Most people fear death. But what if death wasn't the end? What if you were trapped in your own rotting body, fully aware, unable to move, scream, or escape? That's the nightmare that Poe brought to life. In the story, a man named Valdemar is on his deathbed. But before he dies, doctors hypnotize him, forcing him to remain conscious as his body begins to decay. The result, Valdemar's body rots, but his mind stays awake. For months, he remains trapped, unable to move, unable to die, only able to whisper in a voice that sounds not quite human. And when the hypnosis is finally lifted, he disintegrates into a pile of rotting flesh. It's one of the first horror stories that explored what it would mean to be undead, not as a monster, but as a prisoner inside your own decaying body. And it introduced something that would become a terrifying staple in zombie horror, the fear of being aware after death. The idea that the dead might still think, but no longer be human. The horror of a body refusing to die properly. Poe's undead weren't flesh-eating creatures. They were something worse. They were trapped souls, and there was no way out. The Gothic obsession with the mindless dead. As the Gothic era continued, more writers became fascinated with the idea of bodies that refused to rest. But there was one major shift. For the first time in literature, some undead weren't just conscious, they were becoming mindless. And that changed everything. Early 19th century novels that explored the fear of mindless death. The String of Pearls, The Birth of the Cannibalistic Undead. This serialized novel introduced Sweeney Todd, the barber who murdered his victims and turned their corpses into meat pies. While not a zombie tale, it played on one of the most horrifying fears of the time, the idea of the dead being consumed. Varney the Vampire, the first infected undead horror. This was one of the first stories where a person could be turned into an undead creature. Though a vampire story, it laid the foundation for the idea that the undead could spread like a disease, an idea that would later define modern zombie fiction. The Bodhi Snatcher, When the Dead Become Commodities, written by Robert Louis Stevenson. This novella told the story of doctors who stole corpses for scientific experiments, mirroring real historical fears of grave robbers. It introduced a chilling idea. What if the bodies weren't actually dead? All of these stories paved the way for the modern zombie myth. And by the end of the 19th century, a pattern had emerged. The undead were no longer just supernatural, they were scientific mistakes. The fear shifted from vampires with intelligence to mindless reanimated corpses. The undead were now something that could spread like a plague. In short, the zombie, as we recognize it today, was starting to take shape. How Gothic horror led to the birth of the modern zombie. By the turn of the 20th century, literature had already introduced corpses reanimated by unnatural forces. People trapped inside their own decaying bodies. The spread of undeath like a disease. It was only a matter of time before these ideas combined. And when they did, the zombie fully emerged, not as a myth, but as a genre of horror that would define the next century. Because Gothic horror gave us something more terrifying than monsters. It gave us the fear of what could happen after death. The fear that the body could return, but the soul would never come back. And that's a fear that never dies. In 1937, an American journalist claimed to have seen something impossible, a man who had died and come back. For centuries, the undead belonged to folklore, horror, and superstition. But in the 20th century, something changed. For the first time, reports of real zombies began reaching the Western world, not as legends, not as fiction, but as eyewitness accounts. And it all started in Haiti, a country where the dead didn't always stay buried, and where some people claimed to have seen them return. The first Western reports of Haitian Vodou zombies. The world first learned about Haitian zombies in the early 1900s, when foreign travelers began documenting strange and disturbing local beliefs. At the center of it all was Vodou, a religion born from West African traditions, Catholicism, and the brutal history of slavery. Many outside observers misunderstood Vodou as black magic, sensationalizing its beliefs and practices. But one legend caught their attention more than any other. The idea that a powerful Vodou priest known as a Bokor could bring the dead back to life, not as ghosts, not as spirits, but as mindless, enslaved corpses. To the Western world it sounded impossible, but as more stories emerged, some began to wonder, could zombies be real? The sensationalized myth of the Haitian zombie. In 1929, an American author named William Seabrook traveled to Haiti. He had one goal, to see a zombie for himself. Seabrook was already a well-known writer, famous for his books on occultism, cannibalism, and supernatural folklore. But in Haiti, he found something different in his book, The Magic Island. He described visiting a Haitian plantation where workers were said to be zombies, soulless, reanimated corpses, forced to work the fields with vacant, lifeless eyes. Seabrook wrote, "They moved like automatons, with the glazed eyes of the dead." His book introduced the Zombiestream to mainstream audiences for the first time. And even though scholars later debunked much of Seabrook's account as sensationalized fiction, the damage was done. And the idea of the Haitian Vodou zombie had entered popular culture, and it was about to become even more terrifying, because in the 1960s, an event occurred that seemed to prove zombies were real, the real-life case of Clervius Narcissus, the man who returned from the dead on April 30, 1962. A man named Clervius Narcissus checked into a hospital in Haiti. He was suffering from severe fever, coughing, and body aches. His condition rapidly worsened. Within days, the doctors pronounced him dead. His family held a funeral. His body was buried. For 18 years, Clervius Narcissus was dead and gone. But then, something impossible happened. In 1980, a man walked into a Haitian village and claimed to be Clervius Narcissus. The villagers were horrified. He told them, "I was buried alive. I was turned into a zombie." He even pointed to his own grave, a site that had been undisturbed for nearly 2 decades. His family was shocked. They recognized his face, his voice, and even the small childhood scars on his body. He was Clervius Narcissus. But how? How could a dead man return? The scientific investigation of a real zombie. By the early 1980s, the case of Clervius Narcissus had become famous worldwide. Journalists, scientists, and anthropologists traveled to Haiti to study his case. Their investigation led them deep into the world of Vodou sorcery, poisons, and psychological manipulation. And what they discovered was disturbing. According to Vodou tradition, a Bokor could use a special zombie powder, a toxic blend of herbs, animal parts, and a deadly marine poison to create a state of living death. Western researchers, including Dr. Wade Davis, studied this alleged zombie powder and found its key ingredient, tetrodotoxin, a neurotoxin found in pufferfish. In small doses, it could cause full body paralysis, slowed heart rate at death. Like coma, if Narcissus had been poisoned, he could have appeared dead, been buried alive, and later revived. But the story didn't end there. Narcissus claimed that after being exhumed, he was enslaved on a sugar plantation where he was beaten, drugged, and forced to work without question. If true, it meant that the zombies weren't the walking dead. They were real people, turned into slaves through fear, drugs, and manipulation. This revelation changed everything. The Haitian zombie wasn't supernatural. It was a horrific, real-world practice, one tied to colonialism, oppression, and the darkest parts of history, how Haiti's zombie myth became a global horror icon. The story of Clairvius Narcissus fascinated the world. For the first time, a zombie wasn't just a creature of myth, it was a documented case. Hollywood took notice. Films like White Zombie and I Walked with a Zombie took inspiration from Haitian Vodou myths. The zombie transformed from a mind-controlled slave to a soulless, reanimated corpse. The Western world slowly removed Vodou from the story, turning zombies into something entirely different. By the late 20th century, the idea of the Haitian Vodou zombie had been erased from mainstream horror, and something new had taken its place, the modern, flesh-eating zombie, popularized by movies like Night of the Living Dead. But no matter how much the zombie evolved, its origins remained the same. A fear that started in Haiti, a fear that was, for some, very real. Before zombies craved brains, they served a darker purpose, one rooted in fear, control, and an eerie kind of slavery. By the early 20th century, the Western world had become obsessed with the idea of zombies. But these weren't the flesh-eating, apocalyptic monsters we know today. These zombies were something else entirely. They weren't trying to devour humanity. They were enslaved, mindless, controlled. And the idea of a soulless, reanimated servant terrified the American public. It was in this era, the 1920s to the 1940s, that zombies took their first steps out of folklore and into pop culture. This was the age of pulp fiction, B-movies, and eerie tales that blurred the line between myth and horror, and it all started with a single book, The Magic Island, How Zombies Entered Mainstream America. In 1929, American writer William Seabrook published a travelogue titled The Magic Island. It was an exaggerated, eerie, and deeply sensationalized account of his travels in Haiti. Seabrook claimed to have witnessed something shocking, real zombies. According to his book, he saw Haitian sugar plantation workers with empty, glazed-over eyes, slow robotic movements, no ability to think or resist commands. Seabrook wrote, "They moved like automatons without will or soul. They were living dead." His descriptions were sensational and completely unverified. But The Magic Island electrified American audiences. For the first time, the word zombie entered Western pop culture, and it terrified people. Because these zombies weren't flesh-eating monsters. They were something more disturbing. They were people who had lost control of their own bodies. Pulp fiction writers took notice, and soon zombies were everywhere. Pulp horror, the zombie boom of the 1930s. Throughout the 1930s, American pulp magazines like Weird Tales and Horror Stories capitalized on the zombie craze. Writers twisted Seabrook's ideas into nightmarish horror tales, featuring wealthy plantation owners using Vodou to enslave workers, wick-bokers creating armies of undead servants. The terrifying idea of being buried alive only to wake up under someone else's control. One of the most famous early zombie stories appeared in 1936, Herbert West, Reanimator by H.P. Lovecraft. It took the idea of reanimation, but replaced Vodou with science gone wrong. A mad doctor brought corpses back to life, not as mindless workers, but as violent, unpredictable monsters. This was a key shift in the zombie myth. Zombies were no longer just mind-controlled slaves. Now they were science experiments gone wrong. This idea would soon take over Hollywood. White Zombie, the first zombie movie in 1932, the first ever zombie film was released, White Zombie, starring horror icon Bela Lugosi. The film brought the Haitian zombie myth to the silver screen. The plot was simple but disturbing. A young woman named Madeline arrives in Haiti. A sinister Vodou master, Murder Legender, wants her for himself. He poisons her, faking her death. When she is buried, he revives her as a mindless zombie. Her fate is worse than death. She is alive but soulless, unable to think, unable to resist. The film terrified audiences, not because of gore or violence, but because of its psychological horror. The idea of losing control, of becoming an empty shell, walking but not living, was horrifying. And this was exactly what Americans feared in the 1930s, because White Zombie wasn't just about superstition. It played on deeper, real-world fears. The fear beneath the fiction, The zombie as a symbol of slavery. White Zombie wasn't just a horror film, it was a reflection of history. The movie, like The Magic Island, borrowed heavily from Haitian Vodou beliefs. But these stories ignored the real source of the zombie myth, the legacy of slavery. For centuries, Haiti had been controlled by European colonial powers who brutally enslaved its people, even after gaining independence. Haitians feared that slavery could return, not through chains, but through supernatural control. The Vodou zombie was a symbol of enslavement, a person robbed of their free will, forced to work to obey without ever being able to fight back. In America, this struck a nerve. The Great Depression had left millions in poverty, jobless, hopeless. Many Americans feared becoming powerless, trapped in a system beyond their control. The zombie became a metaphor for that fear. It wasn't just a creature of myth anymore. It was a reflection of society's deepest anxieties. The shift from spiritual enslavement to physical reanimation. By the late 1930s and 1940s, zombies in fiction began to change. They were no longer just enslaved corpses under a Boker's control. Now, stories started exploring the undead as mindless killers. Zombies created through science, not magic. The fear of losing identity, not just free will. Movies like Revenge of the Zombies and I Walked with a Zombie leaned less on Vodou and more on unnatural resurrection. By the time the 1950s arrived, zombies had begun evolving. Science fiction and Cold War paranoia were about to change the zombie myth forever. And soon, the modern zombie apocalypse would be born. In the 1950s, the dead didn't just rise from the grave, they were awakened by the atom bomb. By the time the 1950s arrived, the world had changed. Zombies were no longer just the enslaved corpses of Vodou legend. They weren't just products of dark magic or ancient curses. A new kind of fear had gripped the world, a fear that reshaped all of horror fiction, including the zombie myth. It was the fear of radiation, the fear of science gone wrong, the fear of atomic war. And just like that, zombies were reborn. The Cold War's influence on horror. The 1950s were defined by paranoia. The world had just witnessed the horrors of World War II. And now, a new kind of war had begun, one that didn't need soldiers or battlefields. The Cold War had turned into a nuclear arms race, and everyone lived under the constant threat of atomic annihilation, with the US and the Soviet Union stockpiling nuclear weapons. The fear was inescapable. Could the world end in an instant? What would happen to the people caught in the blast? Could radiation change the human body, or bring the dead back to life? In horror and sci-fi stories, the answer was clear. Radiation didn't just kill people, it created monsters. And for the first time, zombies weren't controlled by a Boker or a mad scientist. They were mindless products of nuclear disaster. How radiation became the new cause of undead horrors. In the 1950s, American pop culture became obsessed with radiation-mutated creatures. Comic books, pulp magazines, and drive-in horror films turned nuclear energy into a nightmare. And soon, zombies joined the wave of radioactive horrors. In 1954, comic book publishers like EC Comics introduced new stories that blended nuclear terror with the undead. One famous example, Tales from the Crypt and its infamous story of a corpse that rises from its grave after being exposed to radiation. Instead of the traditional Vodou zombie, this creature was glowing with atomic energy, mutated beyond recognition, driven by a mindless hunger instead of simple obedience. This was a huge shift. Zombies were no longer servants of dark magic. They were unstoppable forces of nature. They were no longer soulless workers. They were monsters born from mankind's own mistakes. The evolution of zombies in comics and pulp horror. The 1950s saw an explosion of pulp fiction featuring zombie, like creatures created by science. Some of the most popular themes included dead soldiers revived by government experiments, mutated corpses returning from atomic test sites, nuclear waste turning entire towns into zombie-like creatures. One standout example, the 1955 pulp novel The Brain Eaters by Fritz Leiber. It didn't use the word zombie, but the creatures were eerily familiar. people infected by an unseen force, loss of free will and identity, a slow, unstoppable spread of horror. This book, and others like it, helped push the zombie out of the supernatural realm and into the world of sci-fi horror. And in 1959, this idea hit the big screen in a way that changed horror forever. The movie that introduced sci-fi zombies, Invisible Invaders. If you've never heard of Invisible Invaders, you're not alone. Released in 1959, this low-budget horror film wasn't a blockbuster, but its concept, it was groundbreaking. The movie introduced a terrifying idea. Aliens invade Earth by reanimating the dead. The aliens don't just control corpses. They turn them into unstoppable walking husks. These zombie-like creatures are mindless but deadly, unstoppable because they feel no pain, a reflection of Cold War paranoia. What if we lost control of our own dead? This film set the stage for a much bigger transformation, because just a decade later, in 1968, zombies would change forever. The final shift, the birth of the modern zombie. By the end of the 1950s, zombies had evolved in three major ways. They were no longer magical. They were the result of science. They were no longer servants. They were monsters in their own right. They were no longer limited to Haiti. They were a global threat. The zombie had transformed from a mind-controlled worker into a scientific nightmare. In 1968, zombies weren't just monsters. They became a mirror for our worst fears. By the late 1960s, zombies had already gone through centuries of evolution. They had shifted from Vodou mythology to science fiction nightmares, appearing in pulp magazines, radio dramas, and low-budget horror films. But they were still missing something. They weren't truly terrifying yet. They weren't icons of horror, not in the way vampires or werewolves were. Then, in 1968, everything changed. A low-budget black and white film, directed by a young filmmaker named George A. Romero, would redefine everything. And in doing so, it would create the modern zombie as we know it today. This was the beginning of Night of the Living Dead and the birth of a new era of horror. How 1968 redefined a zombie forever. Before Night of the Living Dead, zombies were still seen as slow, mindless slaves, either controlled by Vodou sorcerers or the result of scientific accidents. They weren't a true, independent threat. They weren't apocalyptic creatures. That all changed in 1968. George A. Romero, an unknown filmmaker from Pittsburgh, had a radical new idea. What if zombies weren't just reanimated corpses? What if they were relentless in their hunger, a disease that spread like wildfire? A metaphor for the fears of a collapsing society. And most importantly, what if they weren't just horror villains, but reflections of real-world chaos? The shift from Vodou to virus-based Undead, one of the biggest changes Romero made. He completely removed the supernatural elements from zombie lore. No more bokers controlling the dead. No more ancient curses or rituals. Instead, zombies were a biological nightmare. In the film, the dead rise due to a mysterious radiation leak from a crashed space probe. But here's the genius part. Romero never fully explains it. This was a game changer. Instead of giving zombies a clear origin story, he made their rise unpredictable, uncontrollable, and terrifyingly real. This set the stage for a new zombie mythos. The dead could rise from anywhere. They weren't controlled by anyone. They existed for one reason, to consume the living. This single change revolutionized the genre and laid the foundation for every zombie film that followed. A new kind of horror, flesh-eating ghouls. Before Night of the Living Dead, zombies didn't eat people. They were mindless. Sure, but they weren't cannibals. Romero changed that forever. His zombies weren't just shambling corpses. They were flesh-eating monsters. For the first time, zombies were driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh, spread by biting their victims, a never-ending plague that only grew worse. And that final change, biting is an infection, that rewrote the zombie rulebook. Now, if you were bitten, you didn't just die. You became one of them. This introduced a terrifying new question in zombie horror. What happens when the people you love turn into the enemy? And just like that, the apocalypse began. the social and political themes hidden in the film. Romero wasn't just making a horror movie, he was making a statement about America. And that's why Night of the Living Dead became more than just a cult classic. It became a cultural turning point. Let's break down the three biggest themes that made this movie legendary. Race and civil rights in America. One of the most groundbreaking elements of the film was its lead character, Ben, played by Duane Jones. This was the first time in horror history that a black actor was cast as the main protagonist, not as a side character, not as comic relief, but as the hero. And the film never calls attention to his race. He's simply the most capable, intelligent survivor in the house. But when you put this in the context of 1968 America, during the height of the civil rights movement, it becomes even more powerful. The ending was brutal, realistic, and unforgettable. After surviving the night, Ben is shot and killed by law enforcement, mistaken for a threat, in a country still dealing with racial violence and injustice. This was a horrifyingly real moment. The collapse of society. In traditional horror movies, there was always a solution. A hero would emerge. The government would step in. Somehow, order would be restored. Not in Night of the Living Dead. Romero's film showed a world completely falling apart. The government was powerless. The military couldn't stop the spread. Ordinary people turned against each other instead of working together. It wasn't the zombies that were the real danger. It was human nature itself. This theme would go on to define the entire zombie genre for decades to come. Media, fake news, and misinformation. Throughout the movie, we see characters watching news broadcasts for updates. But instead of helping, the media spreads confusion. One moment, they say the zombies are caused by radiation. The next, they say it's something else entirely. No one knows what's true, and that uncertainty only makes things worse. This idea that people can't trust the media during a crisis was way ahead of its time. Romero predicted how misinformation would shape real-world disasters, and this theme became even more relevant in later zombie films. The aftermath, how this film created the modern zombie. Before Night of the Living Dead, zombies were a niche horror concept. Afterward, they became one of the biggest monsters in horror history. Romero's film set the new zombie rules, which are still used in every zombie movie, show, and game today. Zombies are undead corpses, reanimated by an unknown cause. They crave human flesh. They infect others through bites. If you get bitten, you turn. The only way to kill them. Destroy the brain. This film didn't just inspire future zombie movies. It defined them. Without Night of the Living Dead, we wouldn't have Dawn of the Dead. 28 days later, The Walking Dead, every zombie apocalypse story ever written. From slow, shambling corpses to fast, moving nightmares, the zombie evolved, spreading across the world like an unstoppable infection. By the 1970s, zombies weren't just a niche horror monster anymore. They were becoming something bigger. They had already crawled out of Haitian folklore, walked through Pulp Fiction, and staggered into Hollywood. But after Night of the Living Dead, something changed. Zombies didn't just exist in horror movies anymore. They became a reflection of society itself, and no film captured this better than the one that followed in 1978. It was called Dawn of the Dead, and it didn't just bring zombies back, it made them unstoppable. Dawn of the Dead zombies as a critique of consumerism. If Night of the Living Dead was about racial tension, misinformation, and the collapse of order, then Dawn of the Dead was about something just as terrifying: consumerism. The film takes place in a shopping mall, and that was no accident. Romero wanted to make a statement. Zombies weren't just monsters. They were us, mindless, wandering, obsessed with things, but never truly satisfied. And what's even scarier, in the film, the survivors aren't much better. Instead of escaping, they take over the abandoned mall, hoarding supplies and indulging in luxuries, while the world outside crumbles. It was brilliant social commentary disguised as a horror movie, and it made zombies bigger than ever. The explosion of zombie horror in Italian cinema, while Romero was reshaping zombie horror in America, Italy was creating something different. The late 70s and early 80s saw an explosion of European zombie films, and they were darker, bloodier, and more surreal than anything before. These films took zombies to new extremes, pushing the boundaries of gore and horror. Some of the most infamous examples included Zombie 2 Tio Fulci's Nightmare Vision. Released as an unofficial sequel to Dawn of the Dead, featured one of the most infamous scenes in horror history, a zombie vs. a shark. Introduced rotting, MAGA-infested zombies that became iconic in Italian horror, City of the Living Dead supernatural zombies. Combined occult horror with zombie terror, featured teleporting, brain-crushing undead. Blended cosmic horror with traditional zombie tropes. The Beyond is Zombies in the Gates of Hell. Took zombies out of science fiction and back into supernatural horror. Featured some of the most graphic zombie deaths ever put on film. Helped cement Italy's signature dreamlike, nightmarish take on the undead. These movies weren't just copies of Romero's films. They were something else entirely. Pure horror, dopeless. Unlike Dawn of the Dead, where his survivors had some control, in these films there was no escape. The zombies always won. And that leads us to one of the biggest zombie debates of all time, the birth of the fast, slow zombies debate. For decades, zombies were slow. They shuffled. They dragged their feet. They were relentless, but they weren't fast. That was part of their horror. No matter how far you ran, they always caught up eventually. But in the 1980s, that started to change. Some films experimented with faster, more aggressive zombies, leading to a divide that still exists today. The case for slow zombies. Classic horror. They represent inevitable death. You can run, but you can't escape forever. Psychological terror. They build dread. The fear isn't in the chase, but in knowing you're trapped. More realistic decay. A rotting corpse shouldn't be able to sprint. The case for fast zombies. More intense action. The fear isn't in waiting, it's in running for your life. A new level of horror. Slow zombies can be avoided. Fast zombies, not so much. A better representation of disease and infection. Viruses spread fast. So shouldn't zombies? This debate would only grow stronger in the coming decades, and soon, fast zombies would take over the genre. Still here, you're a true survivor. Subscribe for more deep dive horror stories. Zombies weren't just in movies anymore. They were in your hands, controlling the way you played, the stories you experienced, and the nightmares you had. By the time the 1990s arrived, zombies had already taken over cinema, but that wasn't enough. They needed more. More control, more fear, more ways to spread. And the 90s gave them exactly that, because this was the decade when zombies escaped the screen and invaded pop culture in ways no one saw coming. Resident Evil, how gaming changed zombie storytelling. Before the 90s, horror games were rare. Sure, there were creepy titles like Alone in the Dark, but nothing truly captured the terror of zombies. Not until 1996. That's when Capcom released a game that would define a generation of horror fans. A game that didn't just use zombies. It made you fight for your life against them. That game was Resident Evil, and it changed everything. The game that put zombies in your hands. For the first time, player just watching a zombie outbreak. They were in it, trapped in a mansion, low on ammo, unsure if the next hallway held a way out or a way to die. The game did something no movie could. It made you feel vulnerable. It made every bullet count, and it made zombies terrifying again. But Resident Evil did more than just scare players. It reinvented zombie storytelling. This wasn't about ancient curses or random resurrections anymore. This was about science gone wrong. Viruses, mutations, bioweapons. The zombie apocalypse wasn't supernatural anymore, it was man-made. And that idea would reshape the entire zombie genre. The 90s. Zombies spread to every corner of pop culture. Resident Evil wasn't alone in reshaping the zombie myth. Throughout the 90s, zombies were everywhere. In movies, in books, in comics, even in TV shows. But they weren't all the same. Some stories kept them slow and mindless. Others made them faster, meaner, and angrier than ever. And then came a movie that would change the rules forever. 20 days later, the birth of rage zombies. For decades, zombies had been undeniable, but they had also been predictable. They shuffled. They moaned. They overwhelmed you slowly. And then in 2002, that changed. A British horror film called 28 Days Later did something no other zombie film had done before. It made the undead run. But these weren't just fast zombies. They were something worse. Rage-infected monsters. And they weren't dead at all. How 28 Days Later changed zombie horror. Zombies were no longer reanimated corpses. They were living people infected with a virus. Instead of decay, these zombies were sprinting, shrieking nightmares. The infection didn't take hours or days, it took seconds. And just like that, zombies weren't just back, they were evolving, faster, more dangerous, more terrifying than ever before. Zombies take over comics, books, and TV, with video games and movies pushing the genre forward. The rest of pop culture followed. By the late 90s, zombie stories were everywhere. The Walking Dead introduced long-form zombie storytelling, showing survival over years, not days. Focused on human drama just as much as The Undead, would later become one of the biggest TV shows of all time. World War Z imagined the zombie apocalypse as a global war, introduced the idea of governments and militaries fighting zombies at scale, showed how different cultures, economies, and politics would handle the outbreak. These stories weren't just about horror anymore. They were about society, survival, and the collapse of civilization itself. And they were just getting started. Once, zombies were a niche horror trope, but in the 2000s, they took over the world. One screen, one book, one game at a time. For decades, zombies lurked in the shadows of horror culture. They were cult favorites, not mainstream icons. But that changed in the 2000s and 2010s. Zombies didn't just appear in horror anymore. They dominated everything: movies, TV, books, video games, even blockbuster Hollywood films. This wasn't just a revival of the zombie genre. This was the golden age of zombies. The Walking Dead, the show that made zombies unstoppable. For years, zombies had thrived in films and games. But in 2010, they did something no one expected. They took over television. And the show that did it, The Walking Dead, when it premiered on October 31, 2010, no one knew just how big it would become. But by the end of its first season, it was unstoppable. Why The Walking Dead was a game changer. It wasn't just about zombies. It was about survival, human drama, and moral choices. It showed the slow decay of civilization, not just the first days of the outbreak. It made zombies mainstream, bringing millions of new fans to the genre. By its third season, The Walking Dead was pulling in over 12 million viewers per episode. By its peak, that number doubled. This was more than a show. This was a cultural event. Zombies weren't just a horror staple anymore. They were primetime television. And The Walking Dead wasn't the only thing fueling the golden age of zombies. Because while the show was dominating TV, another zombie story was reshaping literature. World War Z, the book that made zombies bigger than ever. In 2006, author Max Brooks released a book that would change zombie fiction forever. It wasn't just another survival story. It wasn't about a single group of people trying to escape the undead. It was a global history of the zombie outbreak. It was called World War Z, and it did something no zombie story had done before. It treated the zombie apocalypse like a real historical event. Why World War Z was revolutionary. It expanded the scale. Instead of one town, it covered the entire world. It explored how governments, militaries, and societies would handle zombies. It was structured as a series of survivor interviews, making it feel terrifyingly real. World War Z broke out of the horror niche. It became a mainstream bestseller. It was read by people who had never been into zombie stories before. And, of course, it was only a matter of time before Hollywood took notice. World War Z, the first zombie blockbuster. By the 2010s, zombies weren't just in horror movies anymore. They were in big, budget Hollywood blockbusters. And no film proved that more than World War Z. It starred Brad Pitt. It had a $190 million budget. And it was the highest grossing zombie film of all time. But it wasn't just about box office numbers. It was about scale. For the first time, a zombie movie showed tens of thousands of zombies swarming cities in minutes. Governments treating the outbreak like a global war. Humanity on the verge of extinction, not just isolated pockets of survivors. It wasn't a slow, creeping apocalypse anymore. This was a full-scale, world-ending event, and it proved that zombies weren't just for horror fans anymore. They were for everyone. Zombies invade video games, Left 4 Dead, Call of Duty, and more. The 2000s and 2010s didn't just belong to zombie movies and TV shows. They also took over gaming. And they did it in two ways: fast-paced, action-heavy zombie shooters, deep, story-driven survival horror experiences. Left 4 Dead, the ultimate zombie shooter, one of the biggest zombie games of the era, was Left 4 Dead. This game was different. Instead of slow, shambling undead, it introduced fast, aggressive hordes that never stopped chasing you, special effects like the tank and witch to make the fight unpredictable. 4-player co-op, turning survival into a team effort. Left 4 Dead didn't just make zombies scarier, it made them relentless. Call of Duty zombies, when even war games added the undead. Then there was Call of Duty, a game about war, a game about soldiers, a game that had nothing to do with zombies until 2008, when they released Nazi Zombies mode in Call of Duty World at War. At first, it was just an extra mode, a fun little bonus, but then it exploded. Soon, every Call of Duty game had its own zombie storyline. By the time Black Ops released, it wasn't just a side mode anymore. It was a full-on, time-traveling apocalyptic story. It had iconic zombie maps that became legendary, a deep, mysterious lore that fans spent years piecing together. Millions of players logging in just for zombies. This wasn't just a trend. Zombies had become a gaming staple, and it wasn't stopping anytime soon. Zombies and everything, the ultimate pop culture monsters. By the 2010s, zombies had become more than horror. They had fully taken over. Zombies weren't just in movies like Zombieland and Train to Busan, TV shows like The Walking Dead and iZombie, video games like The Last of Us and Dying Light. They were in books like Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, comics like Marvel Zombies, even commercials and music videos. Zombies had gone from B-movie monsters to some of the most recognizable creatures in pop culture history. And while the golden age of zombie media eventually began to fade, their legacy remained, because even if zombies slow down, they always come back. What if zombies weren't just fiction? What if nature already made them? For centuries, zombies were seen as pure fantasy, a fictional nightmare, a myth with no real world basis. But what if that wasn't true? What if zombies already exist, just not in the way we expect? Because deep in nature, there are creatures that experience something terrifyingly close to zombification. Parasites, fungal infections, neurotoxins, things that can control minds, hijack bodies, and turn the living into puppets. This isn't just science fiction. This is real, the mind-controlling fungi, the real-life cordyceps horror. In the depths of rainforests, a tiny fungus does something straight out of a horror movie. It infects its victim, it takes over its brain, and it controls its movements until it forces the victim to its death. This nightmare organism is called Ophiocordyceps unilateralis. Most people know it by another name, the zombie ant fungus. How it works: the fungus releases microscopic spores into the air. An ant accidentally inhales them. The spores travel to the ant's brain and begin rewiring its nervous system. The infected ant loses control of its body. It starts climbing to higher ground, no matter what. The fungus forces the ant to lock its jaws onto a leaf or branch. And then it kills the ant from the inside. And the worst part, after the ant dies, the fungus keeps growing, bursting out of its head, and it releases more spores waiting for the next victim. If this sounds terrifyingly familiar, it's because this concept inspired the video game The Last of Us, A story about a fungal zombie outbreak based on a real-world parasite. Rabies, the closest thing to a real zombie virus. Most zombie outbreaks start with a virus, something that infects the bloodstream, takes over the brain, and turns the host into a mindless, aggressive creature. In reality, there's already a disease like that, and it's been around for thousands of years. It's called rabies. How rabies mimics zombie symptoms. It spreads through bites and saliva, just like a zombie infection. It travels to the brain and causes violent aggression. Victims lose their ability to control their actions. In later stages, they lose fear, become hyper-aggressive, and attack at random. Once symptoms appear, it's 100% fatal. Rabies doesn't just turn animals into mindless, foaming beasts. It can happen to humans too. And if the virus ever mutated, it's terrifying to think how close we already are to a real zombie outbreak. Toxoplasma, the parasite that controls minds. Right now, there's a parasite that has already infected over 2 billion people. You might have it and not even know it. It's called Toxoplasma gondii. And while it doesn't turn humans into mindless zombies, it does something even creepier. It rewires behavior. How Toxoplasma alters the brain. This parasite normally infects rats and mice. Once inside, it targets the brain and does something terrifying. It removes their fear of predators, specifically cats. Infected mice stop running away from danger. Instead, they become reckless, moving closer to predators instead of avoiding them. Eventually, they get eaten by a cat, which is exactly what the parasite wants, because inside a cat, Toxoplasma can reproduce. It's an evolutionary trick that lets the parasite control its host's brain just long enough to complete its cycle. Now, here's the scary part. Humans can get infected too. And while it doesn't turn us into zombies, studies suggest it might make people more reckless, aggressive, and impulsive. Some researchers even believe it could be linked to mental health disorders. So while Toxoplasma doesn't create flesh-eating zombies, it proves that parasites can control behavior, and that alone is terrifying. Neurotoxins, the science behind Vodou zombies. For centuries, there have been stories of people dying and then coming back, not as undead monsters, but as mindless, empty shells. These were the Vodou zombies of Haiti. And while the folklore describes them as cursed souls, the reality is even darker. Because some of these cases may have a real-world explanation. A neurotoxin called tetrodotoxin. How tetrodotoxin mimics zombie effects. It's found in pufferfish and other toxic creatures. In small doses, it paralyzes the victim, slowing their heart rate and breathing until they appear dead. If the dose isn't fatal, the person wakes up hours or days later, but in a dazed, dream-like state. Some victims reported feeling like they were trapped inside their own bodies, unable to resist commands. In Haitian Vodou, some bokers as sorcerers were rumored to use this toxin to fake deaths. Then, after burial, they would revive the victim, convincing them they had become zombies. It sounds impossible, but some researchers believe real cases of this happened, that people were chemically turned into mindless slaves, unable to resist commands. Not through magic, but through science. Could a real zombie apocalypse happen? Zombies are fictional, but everything we've discussed, it's real. Mind-controlling parasites, aggressive, brain-altering viruses, neurotoxins that mimic death itself. We already have organisms that can control a host's mind and force it to do its bidding. Spread through bites and saliva, infecting others. Turn the infected into reckless, violent versions of themselves. Right now, none of these things combine into one single zombie virus, but if nature has already created all the ingredients, it's not impossible to imagine a scenario where a mutation, bioweapon, or unknown pathogen puts the pieces together. And if that ever happened, we wouldn't be ready. Because, in the end, the scariest thing about zombies isn't that they exist in fiction. It's that nature has already experimented with them. And we might just be one mutation away from the real thing. What if zombies weren't just science fiction? What if nature had already created them? For thousands of years, humans have feared the idea of losing control, of becoming a prisoner inside their own body, of being alive but not in control. In zombie fiction, this happens because of viruses, curses, or experiments gone wrong. But in nature, this already happens. Because parasites, some of the most terrifying organisms on Earth, have mastered the art of mind control. They can hijack the brains of their victims, force them to act against their will, and use their bodies as puppets till they die in horrifying ways. And the scariest part, many of these parasites target the nervous system, altering behavior in ways that are disturbingly similar to zombies. Right now, they only infect insects and animals. But what if they evolved? What if one day they learned how to infect humans? Would we even know it was happening? Or would we lose control before we even realized what was going on? Ophiocordyceps, the fungal horror that controls insects. Deep in the jungles of South America, something unnatural is happening. A tiny insect stops moving, its legs tremble. Then it starts climbing. Not because it wants to, but because something inside it is forcing it to. This is the work of Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, a parasitic fungus that turns ants into zombies. How it works. The fungus infects an ant by releasing microscopic spores into the air. The spores attach to the ant's body and begin burrowing inside. Once inside, they invade the ant's brain, hijacking its nervous system. The ant loses control of its own movements. It's no longer acting on its own. The fungus forces the ant to climb to a high point where it locks its jaws onto a leaf or branch. Then it kills the ant from the inside out. A spore-filled stalk bursts through the ant's head, releasing thousands of new spores. And the cycle begins again. The ant never had a choice. It was alive, but it wasn't in control. It was a prisoner inside its own body, until the fungus no longer needed it. Now imagine this happening to something bigger, something smarter. What if a parasite like this ever evolved to infect humans? The parasitic wasp that creates zombie cockroaches. If you think zombie ants are bad, there's something even worse. A parasite that doesn't just control its host, it turns them into obedient slaves. This is the work of the emerald jewel wasp. How this parasitic wasp controls cockroaches. The wasp stings a cockroach twice, first to paralyze its front legs, then to inject venom into its brain. The venom blocks the roach's ability to control its own movements. But it doesn't kill the roach. Instead, the cockroach remains alive, completely aware, but unable to resist commands. The wasp then grabs the roach's antennae and leads it like a leash. The roach follows willingly, unable to think for itself. The wasp drags it into a burrow, where it lays an egg inside its body. The cockroach sits motionless, making no attempt to escape. Days later, the larva hatches, eating the roach from the inside out. The cockroach never fought back. It could have run away, but the venom stole its ability to resist. It was a living corpse, an obedient zombie, waiting to be eaten alive. What if these parasites could infect humans? Right now, these parasites only target insects. But what if something like this evolved to infect humans? Could a mind-controlling parasite hijack our nervous systems? Could it make us follow commands, unable to resist? It sounds like science fiction, but maybe it's only a matter of time. Because parasites are constantly evolving. And if nature has already created ways to control the mind, what's stopping it from going further? Are humans already infected without knowing? The idea of a parasite controlling human behavior sounds terrifying. But what if it's already happening? Right now, over 2 billion people are infected with a real parasite that alters behavior. It's called Toxoplasma gondii. And while it doesn't turn people into mindless zombies, it does something even more disturbing. How Toxoplasma alters human behavior. Normally, this parasite infects rats and mice. Once inside, it targets the brain and removes their fear of predators, specifically cats. The infected rodent starts acting recklessly, wandering into danger without hesitation. Eventually, it gets eaten by a cat, which is exactly what the parasite wants, because it reproduces inside cats. Now here's the scary part. Humans can also be infected. and studies suggest that toxoplasma may alter human behavior too. Some infected people show higher risk taking behavior. Some studies link it to aggression, impulsivity, and even psychiatric disorders. Some researchers believe it might play a role in schizophrenia. If a tiny parasite can change human behavior, what else is possible? Could there be something even more advanced waiting to be discovered? Or, worsey, could something already be controlling us without us even realizing it? The future of mind, control parasites. Right now, parasites like Ophiocordyceps and Toxoplasma are mostly limited to insects and small animals. But what if one day they evolve? What if a new strain emerges? One that targets the human nervous system? Would we even know we were infected? Or would we simply lose control? Because in the end, zombies don't have to be dead. They just have to be alive, but not in control. And if nature has already perfected mind control in insects, who's to say we're not next? What if the zombie virus already exists? What if it's been with us all along, waiting to evolve? For centuries, humans have feared a disease that robs its victims of reason, a disease that spreads through bites, that turns the infected into violent, mindless creatures, that strips them of humanity, leaving behind only rage and hunger. This isn't science fiction. This disease is real, and its name is rabies. Right now, rabies only affects a small percentage of the population. It's slow moving with an incubation period that can last weeks or months. And it doesn't turn people into true zombies. But what if it mutated? What if a new strain appeared? One that was faster, more aggressive, and impossible to stop? Will we be one mutation away from a real zombie outbreak? How rabies spreads like a zombie virus. Rabies is a viral infection that attacks the central nervous system. Once inside the body, it begins slowly creeping toward the brain. It starts with flu-like symptoms: fever, headache, weakness. Then comes confusion, aggression, and uncontrollable movements. Victims lose their ability to swallow, leading to the signature foaming at the mouth. As the infection worsens, they experience paralysis, hallucinations, and fits of violent rage. And the most terrifying part, rabies rewires the brain to spread itself. It makes victims more aggressive, increasing their chances of biting others. It shuts down the ability to drink water, keeping the virus concentrated in the saliva. The virus forces its host to attack, ensuring it can pass to a new victim. The spreading by bite mechanism is exactly how zombie infections work in horror stories. And if rabies ever mutated into a faster, stronger version, would we even be able to stop it? Symptoms that resemble classic zombie tropes. The symptoms of rabies are disturbingly similar to what we see in zombie fiction. Infected become irrational and aggressive. Victims experience extreme aggression. Zombies spread the infection through bites. Rabies spreads exclusively through bites. The virus hijacks the brain, changing personality. Rabies directly alters brain function. Infected can't drink water. Rabies causes intense fear of water. No cure. Death is inevitable once symptoms show. Rabies is 100% fatal once symptoms appear. Victims lose control of their body and mind. Rabies causes spasms, seizures, and hallucinations. In the final stages, rabies victims enter a state of mindless, a violent delirium. They lunge at anything nearby. They bare their teeth like an animal. They are driven by pure instinct, just like the zombies we see in movies and games. Now imagine if rabies became faster, stronger, and more contagious. How long would it take before the world collapsed into chaos? Could a mutated rabies strain cause a zombie outbreak? Right now, rabies has one major weakness. It takes too long to spread. It incubates slowly, meaning victims don't become aggressive for weeks or even months. But what if that changed? What if a new strain evolved? One that worked faster? Virologists have theorized that rabies could mutate in several terrifying ways. Shorter incubation period instead of weeks or months. Symptoms could develop in hours or days. Airborne transmission right now, rabies spreads through bites. But what if it could spread through the air, like the flu? More extreme aggression, a mutation could make the infected more violent, stronger, and faster. Higher survival rates in hosts instead of killing its host. A mutated strain could keep them alive longer, making them walking spreaders. In a worst-case scenario, this could create a perfect storm. A virus that spreads faster than we can contain it, an infection that turns victims into rage-driven attackers, a disease with no cure once symptoms appear. Sound familiar? That's exactly how zombie outbreaks begin in fiction. But could it actually happen? Many scientists say yes, if the right mutation ever appeared. Real cases that hint at a zombie-like future. There have already been cases where rabies acted in ways that terrified doctors. Case 1, the fast-moving rabies strain. In 2013, doctors in India observed a strain of rabies that moved much faster than usual. Instead of taking weeks to months, symptoms developed in just days. Victims became agitated, aggressive, and lost control almost immediately. Case 2, the rabies outbreak in Angola. Over 1,000 cases of human rabies were reported. With a high number of violent symptoms, the outbreak spread rapidly, overwhelming hospitals. Authorities struggled to contain it, fearing it might mutate further. Case 3, rabies-infected wolves attacking entire villages. In 2011, a rabies outbreak in Russia caused packs of wolves to attack humans in isolated villages. The infected wolves showed no fear, no hesitation, and extreme aggression. This was one of the few recorded instances of pack-like infected behavior, eerily similar to how zombies hunt in groups. Each of these cases proves one thing: rabies isn't as stable as we think. It's changing. And if one day it mutates in the wrong way, it could create something far worse than we're prepared for. Are we ready for a rabies zombie outbreak? Right now, rabies has a vaccine, but once symptoms appear, it's 100% fatal. If a new, faster strain emerged, would we be able to contain it in time? Governments have pandemic response plans for flu outbreaks, but not for something like this. If rabies evolved into a highly contagious, aggression-inducing virus, would humanity even stand a chance? Or would we watch society collapse in weeks? Because in the end, maybe zombies were never fiction. Maybe they were just a virus away. What if the most terrifying zombie infection isn't a virus at all? What if it's already inside us, waiting to be triggered? There are many ways to imagine the end of the world. A virus that turns people into mindless husks, a parasite that takes over the brain, a bioweapon engineered to erase human thought. But what if the real answer is something far worse? Something we can't cure, something that doesn't need to spread through bites or air, because it's already inside us, waiting. Meet prions, the silent killers of the brain. Unlike viruses or bacteria, prions don't just infect the body. They rewire the brain itself, corrupting it from the inside out. They don't just kill, they erase. And once they start their work, nothing can stop them. What are prions? The brain destroyers. Prions aren't alive. They have no DNA. They aren't viruses, bacteria, or parasites. Instead, they're misfolded proteins that act like a glitch in the brain's programming. Once they appear, they convert healthy brain tissue into more prions, spreading like a corrupt code in a computer system. Over time, prions turn the brain into a spawnerly. Holes form in the tissue. Neurons die off. The brain rots away from the inside, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop it, because unlike viruses, which the immune system can fight, prions are indestructible. Heat doesn't kill them. Disinfectants don't kill them. The human body can't fight them off. They linger for years, waiting to strike. And once symptoms start, it's already too late. The real-life zombie disease in humans. One of the most terrifying prion diseases is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, a rare but always fatal condition that destroys the brain. The victims of CJD experience symptoms that sound eerily close to zombie horror stories, severe personality changes, from calm to uncontrollable rage, hallucinations and paranoia, hearing voices, seeing things that aren't there, loss of muscle control, shambling, jerking movements, Rapid cognitive decline, forgetting everything, becoming completely unresponsive. Sudden aggression, lashing out without reason. As the disease progresses, victims lose all sense of identity. They become violent, unpredictable, and detached from reality. In the final stages, their brains are so deteriorated that they can't speak, move, or even recognize their own families. And once symptoms begin, death comes within months. But the most disturbing part of prion diseases is how they spread, the creepy link between prions and cannibalism. In Papua New Guinea, there was once a mysterious disease that wiped out entire villages. The locals called it kru, the clapping sickness. Victims would start trembling uncontrollably. They would lose the ability to walk. Then they would burst into fits of manic laughter, right before slipping into a coma and dying. For years, no one understood what caused it. Then scientists made a chilling discovery. Kru was a prion disease, and it was spreading through ritual cannibalism. When infected brain tissue was eaten, prions entered the bodies of the living, passing from one person to another. The more they consumed, the faster the disease spread. This was the first recorded instance of a prion-based disease passing through human consumption, and it raises a terrifying question. If prions can spread through the consumption of infected meat, could a future outbreak turn people into mindless, stumbling, flesh-hungry beings? Would it be a real-world zombie apocalypse, but instead of a virus, it's a prion-based nightmare? Mad cow disease, how prions nearly caused a global crisis. In the 1990s, the world witnessed a real-life prion outbreak, one that nearly spiraled out of control. It started with cows. Farmers, unknowingly, began feeding cattle the remains of other infected cattle. This introduced a prion disease called bovine spongiform encephalopathy, better known as mad cow disease. At first, the cows just seemed disoriented. Then they became aggressive, stumbling and lashing out, and then, after months of suffering, they died in agony. But the real horror began when humans started eating infected beef. Those who consumed contaminated meat developed a human form of mad cow disease, a prion condition that destroyed the brain exactly like Kru and CJD. Their minds rotted away, and death was 100% inevitable. The outbreak was so severe that entire herds of cattle were slaughtered to prevent its spread. Governments banned beef exports. Millions of people lived in fear, wondering if they had already been exposed. And the worst part, since prions can take years or even decades to show symptoms, some infected individuals might still be out there, unaware their brains are decaying right now. Could prions be the real cause of a zombie-like outbreak? Right now, prion diseases are rare. But what if they weren't? What if a new form of prion disease appeared? One that spread faster, lasted longer, and turned its victims into violent, mindless creatures. Scientists warn that certain mutations could make prion diseases more contagious, easily passed through air, water, or simple contact. Slower acting, allowing infected individuals to spread the disease before showing symptoms. More aggressive, causing victims to become violent, unstable, and uncontrollable. Unlike rabies, which is preventable with vaccines, prions can't be stopped. There is no cure, no treatment, no way to fight back. If a prion-based outbreak ever occurred, it wouldn't just spread, it would be unstoppable. Are we already at risk? Some scientists believe that modern food industries could accidentally trigger a new prion disease. Because prions linger in infected meat, a single contaminated batch of beef could expose millions of people worldwide. And since prion diseases take years to show symptoms, by the time we realized what was happening, it would already be too late. Prions wouldn't turn people into Hollywood-style zombies, but they could create something far worse. A world where people slowly lose their minds, where aggression and madness spread like wildfire, where entire generations rot away with no cure, no warning, and no escape. And the scariest part, if prions already exist, maybe the zombie apocalypse has already begun. It's just taking its time. What if some so-called zombies weren't dead, but trapped in a drug-induced nightmare? Zombies are supposed to be the dead risen again, mindless, shambling, hollow shells of their former selves. But what if some weren't actually dead at all? What if they were simply trapped inside their own bodies, fully aware but unable to move, speak, or escape? This isn't a horror movie plot. It's a real-life theory, and it comes straight from Haiti, the birthplace of the modern zombie myth. The terrifying idea: some zombies may have been living people poisoned and buried alive, only to return later changed forever. The Haitian zombie, Vodou, death, and the undead. Haiti has long been associated with zombies, thanks to its rich history of Vodou, a spiritual practice blending African, Caribbean, and Catholic traditions. For centuries, stories circulated about people who died and were buried, only to reappear days or even years later, wandering in a dazed, broken state. Some villagers swore they recognized their own loved ones, except they weren't the same anymore. They didn't remember their past lives. They didn't speak much. They were slow, obedient, and empty-eyed. The legend claimed that powerful Vodou sorcerers, bokers, could turn people into zombies. They weren't raising the dead. They were stealing souls. But how? For years, scientists dismissed these stories as superstition. Then they made a disturbing discovery: the zombie powder, tetrodotoxin in real, living corpses. In the 1980s, a Harvard-trained ethnobotanist named Wade Davis to Haiti traveled to investigate these zombie claims. What he found was chilling. Some villagers whispered about a powder, a powerful poison that could make someone appear dead, only for them to wake up later. They called it coupe de powder, the zombie powder, and its main ingredient, a deadly neurotoxin found in pufferfish, tetrodotoxin, the real zombie drug. Tetrodotoxin is one of the most dangerous toxins in the world. Just a tiny dose can cause full-body paralysis. The victim can't move, speak, or even blink. Slowed heart rate, almost undetectable, making them seem clinically dead. Near-death consciousness. The victim may still be fully aware, trapped in their own body. If a person is buried in this state, they might wake up inside their own grave, confused, traumatized, and gasping for air, and when they finally crawl out of the earth, they look exactly like the zombies of legend. Pale, weak, broken, Clervius Narcissus, the man who became a zombie. The most infamous real-life zombie case was a Haitian man named Clervius Narcissus. In 1962, Narcissus was declared dead by doctors. His family buried him in a coffin, mourning his loss. But 18 years later, a man walked into his old village, one who looked exactly like Narcissus. He claimed he had been buried alive, dug up by a boker, and forced into slavery on a plantation for years. He had memories of what happened, but had been drugged and controlled for nearly 2 decades. The story sent shockwaves through this scientific community. Was it a hoax, or had someone truly found a way to create a real, life zombie? The science of inducing a zombie state. If true, the process of making a zombie might work like this. The boker poisons the victim with tetrodotoxin, inducing a death like paralysis. The victim is buried alive. The boker digs them up later and keeps them in a weakened, drugged state. Over time, the victim suffers brain damage from oxygen deprivation, making them obedient and unresponsive. Essentially, the process would break their mind while keeping their body alive. The result, a real-life zombie, not a reanimated corpse, but a person robbed of their free will. Could this happen today? The dark side of neurotoxins. While Haitian zombies remain a controversial subject, scientists know that neurotoxins like tetrodotoxin can induce death-like states. In fact, certain modern drugs can mimic this effect. Scopolamine can erase memories and make victims extremely suggestible. Ketamine can cause a state of dissociation, where victims become detached from reality. Fentanyl overdoses sometimes resemble death, with victims barely breathing for hours. In theory, a combination of these substances could create a true zombie state where a person is alive but completely detached from their identity. Could criminals or rogue scientists exploit this knowledge? Could a new drug be engineered to create real, obedient zombies? The possibilities are terrifying, because if history has shown us anything, It's that some monsters don't need to be supernatural. They only need the right chemistry. What if zombies weren't born from folklore, but from a classified experiment gone wrong? Throughout history, wars have been fought with swords, guns, and bombs. But what if the next war wasn't fought by soldiers, but by mindless, infected hordes? It sounds like something out of a horror movie, but the idea of weaponized zombies isn't just fiction. It's a real fear that governments, scientists, and even the military have considered for decades. And worse, some declassified documents hint that they've already experimented with it. Bioweapons, the deadliest invisible threat. Since the dawn of civilization, disease has been deadlier than any army. The Black Death wiped out 60% of Europe in the 14th century. The Spanish flu killed more people than World War I. Smallpox devastated entire civilizations before vaccines existed. Governments realized something terrifying. Why waste bullets when you could unleash a virus instead? This led to the rise of biological warfare, the use of disease as a weapon, and some of these experiments sound eerily close to zombie fiction. MK-Ultra and mind control experiments. In the 1950s and 60s, the CIA ran a secret program called MK-Ultra. Its goal, to find ways to control the human mind. The US government tested powerful hallucinogens, hypnosis, and brainwashing techniques on unsuspecting citizens, trying to create obedient human weapons. Some victims claimed they were left mentally broken, unable to think for themselves. A human zombie, not in the flesh, eating sense, but in the loss of free will. The program was eventually exposed, but many declassified files were destroyed. What was the government really trying to achieve? And what if they never stopped experimenting? Soviet bioweapon labs in Veris X. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union ran top secret bioweapon facilities. One of the most notorious was Vector, a lab that housed some of the deadliest viruses on Earth, including smallpox, anthrax, and Ebola. Rumors swirled that they were working on something even worse, a virus designed to destroy higher brain function, because extreme aggression, spread uncontrollably through bites or blood. Sound familiar? These were real-world discussions happening in military labs. What would a zombie virus bioweapon look like? If a government wanted to create a zombie-like virus, what would it take? High transmission rate airborne or spread through bites of bodily fluids. Aggression boost, the infected attack others instead of fleeing. Brain damage, loss of higher thinking, turning victims into mindless husks. No cure impossible to stop once unleashed. Rabies plus Ebola plus Prions means the perfect zombie virus. Some theorists believe a combination of rabies, Ebola, and prion diseases could create something terrifyingly close to a real-life zombie plague. Rabies causes aggression and loss of higher brain function. Ebola spreads through blood and bodily fluids. Prions destroy the brain, leading to mindless, violent behavior. If a lab engineered a hybrid of these, it might not reanimate the dead, but it could create unstoppable infected. Real lab accidents. What happens when deadly viruses escape? History has already shown us what happens when lethal diseases escape laboratories. 1977, the Russian flu, a strain of H1N1 influenza leaked from a Soviet lab, causing a global outbreak. 2004, SAR escapes, the deadly SARS virus leaked from a Beijing research facility. Twice. 2019, COVID-19 lab leak theory. Some scientists believe the virus escaped from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Now imagine if a more aggressive, mind-altering virus got out. If a weaponized rabies strain leaked from a lab, how fast would it spread? And could it be stopped? The US military zombie apocalypse plan. Here's where things get even stranger. In 2011, a declassified military document surfaced called Co-NOP 8888. It was a full-scale plan for how the US military would handle a zombie outbreak. Officially, the government claimed it was a training exercise for handling biological disasters. But the details were bizarrely specific. It classified zombies into categories, including pathogenic zombies created by a virus, radiation zombies raised from the dead due to nuclear exposure, evil magic zombies created by cult forces. It even included battle strategies for fighting hordes of infected. Was it really just a drill? Or did the military know something we didn't? Could a zombie virus be created on purpose? If governments can create mind-altering bioweapons, the bigger question is, would they? If history has taught us anything, it's that nothing is off the table. Biological weapons programs have existed for over a century. Mind control experiments were real and documented. Deadly viruses have escaped labs before. If a government wanted to create an obedient, aggressive, and mindless army, they might not need the dead to rise. They would only need the right virus. And if that virus ever escaped, we wouldn't even have time to stop it, because by the time we noticed, we might already be infected. Ghosts haunt the past, monsters lurk in the shadows, but zombies, they come for us in broad daylight, and they don't stop. Fear is an ancient instinct. It's what kept our ancestors alive in the dark, when the unknown could kill them. Some fears are easy to understand. A predator hunting us, a shadow moving in the dark, something lurking just outside our field of vision. But zombies break every rule of traditional fear. They're not hidden. They're not intelligent hunters. They don't creep in the darkness or whisper from beyond the grave. They just keep coming. The uncanny valley. When the human face becomes a natural, there's something uniquely disturbing about a rotting corpse that still moves. It taps into a psychological phenomenon called the uncanny valley. Our brains are wired to recognize human faces. We feel comforted by normal expressions. But when a face looks almost human, but not quite right, it triggers unease. Think of lifelike dolls, humanoid robots, or corpses with a twisted grin. Zombies should be dead, but they move. They should think, but their minds are empty. They should feel pain, but nothing stops them. It's an unsettling paradox. Our brains tell us, this thing was once human, but now something else, something wrong. Why mindless horde scare ooze more than monsters? Most horror creatures have personality. A vampire is charming, seductive, and intelligent. A werewolf is tragic, a man cursed by his own nature. A ghost is tied to unfinished business, a relic of its former life. But zombies, they have no motives, no vendettas, no emotions. They don't care who you were. They don't want revenge, they just want you. And no matter what you do, they will never stop. That's the true horror of zombies. Not just what they are, but how many there are. A single zombie, you can fight it. But a city, a country, the whole world. The idea of being one of the last survivors in an ocean of undead. That's what keeps us up at night. The psychology of losing control. Zombies don't just threaten our bodies. They attack something deeper, our control over ourselves. If a vampire bites you, you die or turn into something powerful. If a werewolf attacks, it's a single moment of horror. If a ghost haunts you, it's terrifying, but it doesn't erase your identity. But a zombie bite, it steals you. You won't die as yourself. You won't leave a legacy. You won't be remembered for who you were. You'll become the thing you fear. Your body will keep moving, but you won't be inside it anymore. That loss of identity control and humanity is one of the most deeply rooted fears in human psychology. Survival instinct. Why we obsess over zombie media? Despite the fear, people love zombies. From movies to video games to survival guides, zombies have taken over pop culture. But why? Because deep down, we want to believe we'd survive. Zombie stories let us picture ourselves in an apocalyptic world. We imagine what we'd do differently than the characters. We prepare, just in case. It taps into a primal part of the brain, the same part that once told ancient humans to prepare for winter, build fortresses, and outsmart predators. Survival horror isn't just entertainment, it's mental exercise. A way to test, could we do it? Could we last longer than everyone else? Are zombies our greatest fear? Or our greatest fantasy? Zombies are horrifying, but they also represent a twisted kind of freedom. No more 9-to-5 jobs, no more taxes, no more rules. Just pure survival, living by instinct, Making your own path. Some people fear the apocalypse. Others fantasize about it, because in a world overrun by zombies, there's one simple truth: nothing matters except survival. And in a strange way, that's almost liberating. In movies, the zombie outbreak is instant, but in reality, it would unfold like a slow, creeping nightmare. If a zombie outbreak happened tomorrow, it wouldn't start with mass chaos. There'd be no sirens, no sudden military lockdown, no hordes on day one. Instead, it would start quietly, just like every pandemic in history: one sick person, then another, then a cluster, and before anyone realizes the truth, it's too late. The difference between fiction and real outbreaks. Zombie movies love to show instant collapse. One person turns, bites another, and within minutes, the infection spreads like wildfire. Cities fall in hours. The world is gone in days. But in real pandemics, it's never that fast. Take a look at real world viral outbreaks. The Black Death took months to devastate cities. The Spanish flu spread over years, moving through waves. COVID-19 shut down the world. But it wasn't instant, it built up slowly. A real zombie outbreak would follow a similar pattern. It would start as isolated cases. People would go to hospitals, misdiagnosed as drug overdoses or brain infections. Authorities would downplay it, call it a new flu strain, a bad batch of contaminated food. News would trickle in from across the world: strange, violent incidents, missing people, unexplained hospital deaths. And by the time the world realizes what's happening, it's already everywhere. Where the outbreak would hit first. If a zombie virus did exist, where would it spread the fastest? Urban environments, without question. High population density means more people in one place, means faster transmission. Public transportation means subways, buses, and airports would be disaster zones. Hospitals and morgues means the first wave of zombies would likely come from people who died in medical care. If patient zero starts in a major city, the first 48 hours would determine everything. If it spreads undetected, millions could be infected before governments react. If cities lock down early, there's a chance to slow the spread, but it won't last forever. How society would react, and why it will make things worse. No matter where it starts, human behavior would play a huge role in the outbreak spread. Look at real pandemics. People don't believe it at first. Conspiracy theories spread faster than the virus. Governments hesitate to act too soon. In a zombie outbreak, it would be even worse. The first 48 hours. Denial face, it's just another disease. People ignore the first reports. Social media downplays it as a hoax. The infected walk around normally, until it's too late. Misinformation surge. It's a government experiment. Fake cures and miracle treatments go viral. Riots break out over lockdowns and quarantines. People flee big cities, unknowingly spreading the infection. Mass panic and collapse. We're on our own. Police and hospitals get overwhelmed. The military tries to contain outbreaks, but collapses from within. Supply chains break down. The real fight for survival begins. The best and worst places to be. So, where do you want to be when the outbreak really starts? The worst places: instant death traps. Major cities. Too many people. Too many infected. Too few ways out. Hospitals, the first place the infected will appear. Panic zones with overworked doctors and desperate survivors. Airports and subways. Trapped with no escape. If one infected person boards a plane, the entire world is compromised. Military bases. Sounds safe, right? Too many people. Too many weapons. One infected soldier means a fully armed undead army. The best places if you want to survive. Remote cabins see rural areas. Fewer people means fewer zombies. Easier to control entry points. Islands. Zombies can't swim. And probably only a risk if someone infected makes it there first. Mountainous regions. Hard for zombies to travel uphill. Low population density means safer long-term survival. Bunkers is underground shelters. Secure, stocked, and isolated. The only problem, you have to outlast everyone else. Could a zombie virus even exist? The big question, is this all just fiction? Or could a zombie outbreak actually happen? We've already seen real viruses that control behavior. Rabies spreads through bites, causes aggression. Ophiocordyceps, the fungus that takes over ant brains. Prions, brain diseases that cause mindless, violent behavior. If a virus combined all these traits, it wouldn't be called zombies. It would just be a new kind of outbreak, one that changes human behavior in ways we can't control. And if that day comes, it won't be a movie. It'll be the last news report you ever watch. Everyone thinks they'd be the hero in a zombie apocalypse, but the truth, most people wouldn't last a week. The hard truth about zombie survival: when people imagine a zombie outbreak, they always think they'd be the ones to survive. They picture themselves armed and ready, mowing down the undead, living off the land, completely self-sufficient, outsmarting the horde, making it to some hidden safe zone. But in reality, most people would be dead in the first few days, because surviving isn't about guns, toughness, or luck. It's about knowledge, planning, and avoiding the biggest mistakes. Zombie survival myths vis reality. Pop culture romanticizes the apocalypse. Movies, games, and books make it seem survivable, even fun. But let's break down some biggest survival myths and why they get you killed. Myth 1: I just find a gun and start taking out zombies. Reality: most people have zero firearms training. Shooting in high-stress situations is nothing like video games. Guns run out of ammo, and without training, you'll miss more than you hit. The real survivors, they'd use stealth over firepower. Quiet weapons like bats, knives, or bows. Myth 2: I'd head to the nearest store for supplies. Reality: every other survivor has the same idea. Grocery stores, Walmarts, and pharmacies. Death traps. The first days of the outbreak would see mass riots, looting, and bloodshed. The real survivors, they'd already have emergency supplies before the outbreak even starts. Myth 3: I just drive somewhere safe. Reality: roads would be completely blocked. Panicked civilians would clog highways, leading to mass pileups. Running out of gas means trapped in the worst possible place. The real survivors, they'd stay put or take alternate routes, avoiding highways and cities. Myth 4: zombies would be the biggest threat. Reality: other people are just as dangerous, if not worse. Desperate survivors will fight over food, weapons, and shelter. Groups will form, but trust will be dangerous. The real survivors, they'd avoid large groups, keep a low profile, and never assume someone is friendly. The biggest mistakes people would make in a zombie outbreak. Even if you avoid the myths, survival isn't easy. Here are the top mistakes that would get people killed. And mistake 1: staying in cities too long. The first 24 hours are crucial. The longer you stay, the harder it is to escape. Cities means too many people, too many zombies, not enough resources. Mistake 2: wasting energy fighting zombies. The goal isn't to fight, it's to survive. Every fight means a risk of bites, exhaustion, and noise that attracts more undead. The real survivors, they hide, evade, and only fight when necessary. Mistake 3: not thinking about water. People focus on food, but water is even more important. The average person only lasts 3 days without clean water. Contaminated water means deadly diseases, even worse than zombies. Mistake 4: poor shelter choices. Basements means death traps, so no escape if zombies get in. Big buildings means too many entrances. Best shelters: high ground, easy exits, hidden from view. Mistake 5: traveling at the wrong time. Night travel. Too risky. Zombies or not, you can't see danger coming. Daytime. Crowds, survivors, and undead in the open. Best strategy: move during dawn and dusk. Stay hidden during peak hours. How long would humanity actually last? So, let's say the outbreak goes global. Would humanity survive? Or would the zombies win? Scenario 1: zombies overwhelm civilization, so worst case. The infection spreads too fast for governments to contain. Cities fall, and there's nowhere to run. Within weeks, organized society is completely gone. Survival chance: less than 10%. Scenario 2: governments hold the lines of best case. Militaries respond early, using fire breaks and quarantine zones. Critical infrastructure of power, water, hospitals is protected. The infected are isolated before the outbreak spirals. Survival chance, 70 to 80%. Scenario 3, a long-term zombie war. Cities fall, but humans adapt. Safe zones form similar to medieval fortresses. The undead rot over time, making survival easier. Survival chance depends on the human ability to rebuild. So would you survive? Let's be real, most people wouldn't. But if you avoid cities early, stay quiet and hidden, think ahead instead of reacting, control resources and don't take risks, then maybe, just maybe, you'd have a fighting chance. Because in the end, it's not the strongest that survive, it's the smartest. Zombies may be fiction, but what if we're already becoming them? Are zombies already among use? Zombies have always been a creature of horror fiction, a fantasy of the undead. But what if zombies weren't just fiction? What if, through evolution, disease, or technology, we're already becoming them? Science says it's possible. How extreme hunger and isolation change the brain. Survival pushes humans to do the unthinkable. Prolonged starvation, loneliness, and trauma can create behaviors eerily close to zombies. Starvation and cannibalistic urges. In extreme hunger, the brain shuts down rational thought. The body starts craving high protein sources, like flesh. There are real historical cases of humans turning cannibal out of desperation. The famous case of the Donner Party. Trapped in snow, they resorted to eating the dead. Leningrad, 1941. Starving civilians were caught hunting and consuming others. Papua New Guinea. The four tribes' ritualistic cannibalism led to a terrifying disease. Kuru, the psychological collapse of isolation. Zombies lack thought, emotion, and reason. But what happens when humans lose those same things? Long-term isolation has been proven to destroy cognitive function, and brain scans show shrinkage. Because violent, erratic behavior induce a state of mindless repetition, acting without thought. Prisoners in solitary confinement report feeling dead inside after months of isolation. Survivors of extreme loneliness describe losing their sense of reality, like a zombie. Some scientists believe modern social isolation is making us more detached and emotionless. Could our modern world already be pushing us toward zombification? Neurological disorders that mimic zombie behavior. What if an unknown brain disorder swept through humanity? Some diseases already create zombie-like symptoms in real people. Cotard's delusion, the disease that makes you believe you're dead, a rare condition where people genuinely think they're a walking corpse. Patients report feeling empty, decayed, or already buried. Some refuse to eat because they believe they've already died. One man with Cotard's believed he had rotted away and started living in a cemetery. Another patient walked into the ER saying, "I've been dead for weeks. If this disorder spread, would we see real-life zombies wandering the streets?" Brain parasites, the true mind, control threat. We've already discussed Ophiocordyceps, the fungus that controls insects. But what about human parasites? Toxoplasma gondii, a parasite that infects rats. Making them fearless and reckless, scientists discovered it can also infect humans, reducing fear and risk awareness. In theory, a mutated version could turn people into mindless husks. Some studies show that infected humans become more aggressive and impulsive. Over 2 billion people may already carry toxoplasma without knowing it. Could this be the first step toward a real zombie virus? Could a future disease cause real zombies? What if the next pandemic didn't just make people sick, but turn them into something else? Prions, incurable proteins that eat away at the brain, causing mindless aggression. Rabies, if it mutated to spread like the flu, we'd have fast, rage-filled zombies. Synthetic viruses, lab-made diseases designed to control behavior. Mad cow disease showed us how a brain wasting infection can cause violent outbursts. Rabies already spreads through bites. What if it became airborne? Governments have experimented with biological weapons before. What if one went wrong? If a disease altered impulse control, hunger, and aggression, would we even realize it before it was too late? Are we already seeing the first signs? Look at the world today. Some say we're already showing early symptoms of zombification. Mindless consumption, people glued to their phones, unaware of their surroundings, emotional numbness, a society where people feel detached and unfeeling, mass panic and herd mentality, how easily people turn violent in chaos. Ever seen crowds trample each other over Black Friday sales? Look at riots, mass hysteria, or social media mobs, all acting without thought. The brainwashing power of modern technology is already shaping how people think. Maybe zombies aren't a future threat. Maybe they're already here. Maybe we're becoming them. Zombies aren't just horror fiction. They've been used in real military planning. The military's secret obsession with zombies. Zombies may seem like nothing more than horror fiction, but behind closed doors, governments and military strategists have studied them, not as entertainment, but as a real tactical scenario. Because if the undead ever did rise, how would the world fight back? Con Plan 8008, the US military's real zombie defense plan. In 2011, a classified military document leaked. Its name, Con Plan 8008. It wasn't about fighting terrorists or preparing for nuclear war. It was about how to survive a zombie apocalypse. Step-by-step strategies on how to contain and neutralize zombies, different types of undead threats, from radiation zombies to space zombies. Defense tactics for both military forces and civilians. The document was real, created by the U.S. Strategic Command. The military called it a training exercise, but why plan for something that isn't real? Why would the military take zombies seriously? A zombie outbreak isn't just about the dead rising. It's a perfect simulation for real world threats, biological warfare. If a virus spread uncontrollably, how would governments respond? Mass panic and riots. How do you control a population when society collapses? Urban combat simulations. How do you fight an enemy that doesn't feel pain or fear? During the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union ran secret drills for mindless enemy swarms. After COVID-19, experts saw just how fast a virus could bring the world to its knees. Maybe the zombie scenario isn't as fictional as we think. Eerie parallels between modern warfare and undead hordes. Have you ever noticed how zombies and war feel similar? Endless waves of bodies. No thought, no fear. Just mindless destruction. The psychological horror of being outnumbered, surrounded, and hunted. It's no coincidence. Modern military tactics often resemble classic zombie survival strategies. Defensive fortifications, just like in zombie movies. Modern armies build strongholds against overwhelming enemies. Shoot for the head mentality in war. Soldiers are trained to neutralize threats with precision, like a zombie kill shot, dehumanizing the enemy. Throughout history, propaganda has painted enemies as mindless hordes, just like zombies. During World War II, soldiers compared enemy forces to waves of the undead. In Vietnam, and troops described guerrilla fighters as moving through the jungle like ghosts, impossible to kill. And in modern urban warfare, night vision, drones, and mass surveillance allow armies to hunt enemies like they're already dead. Are zombies a reflection of war itself? Or are they preparing us for something worse? Why humanity is obsessed with zombies? Zombies shouldn't be popular. They're grotesque, mindless, monstrous. And yet, we can't stop watching them. Why? Because deep down, zombies tap into something primal in us. The fear of losing ourselves. What's scarier than dying? Losing our minds before we do. The horror of endless war, a fight with no winners, only survivors. The collapse of civilization, a world where the rules are gone and only the strong endure. Every zombie story asks a terrifying question. What would you do if the world ended tomorrow? Would you fight? Would you run? Or would you become one of them? Are zombies preparing us for the future? Look at the world around you. Mass surveillance, governments tracking people's every move, like a zombie outbreak simulation. Technological control, social media creating mindless followers, moving in hordes. Biological threats, viruses mutating faster than we can cure them. Maybe zombies aren't just horror. Maybe they're a warning. Because if civilization collapses, and we lose what makes us human, wouldn't we be zombies already? What if I told you the US government has an actual zombie apocalypse survival plan? A real zombie defense plan. It exists. It sounds like something from a conspiracy theory, but in 2011, a classified military document leaked to the public. Its title, Complan 8008, otherwise known as Counter-Zombie Dominance. Not a joke, not a movie script. A real US military contingency plan, created by US Strategic Command, outlined survival strategies for a full-scale zombie outbreak, detailed how to protect civilians, defend military bases, and eliminate threats. At first, the Pentagon claimed it was a training exercise, but if that's true, why was it so incredibly detailed? Plan 8008. What's actually inside? Plan 8008 breaks zombies into categories, each with different military responses. Here's what the government actually planned for pathogenic zombies, because a mutated virus or bioweapon. Response, quarantine zones, medical research, mass extermination. Sounds exactly like a Hollywood zombie movie or a real-world pandemic. Radiation zombies, because nuclear fallout or extreme radiation exposure. Response, heavy firepower, leads shielding and containment zones. Could radiation actually reanimate the dead? Science says no. But in military fiction they weren't taking any chances. Evil magic zombies, because supernatural forces or dark rituals. Response, the military had no tactical solution for this, just elimination by any means. Even the government threw in supernatural scenarios, just in case. Space zombies. Cause extraterrestrial parasites or intergalactic contamination. Response, isolation, sterilization, and space warfare tactics. Did the Pentagon know something we didn't? Chicken zombies. Because chickens that survive improper euthanasia, digging themselves out of mass graves. Response, no official military action, just better food safety regulations. This actually happened on US farms. The government took notes. How would the military fight zombies? Plan 8008 didn't just categorize zombies, it planned military action against them. Step 1. Secure military bases as fortified strongholds. Step 2. Establish safe zones for survivors. 3. Aggressively eliminate all infected individuals. Step 4. Control information to prevent mass panic. Sound familiar? It's the same formula used in zombie movies, pandemic protocols, and even real military lockdown scenarios. Did the Pentagon take this seriously? At first, the government called it a joke, a training exercise. But some high-ranking officials didn't find it funny. Why would they draft a 31-page zombie defense plan if it was just for fun? Why did it include real tactical responses, evacuation plans, and military chain of command? Why did they prepare detailed containment strategies for a mindless, unstoppable enemy? Some military analysts believe it was a covert way to prepare for real-world threats, bioweapon outbreaks, uncontrollable pandemics, mass riots, and civil unrest. Others, they think the Pentagon knows something about the undead that we don't. If a zombie outbreak happened, would the military win? Movies make it look easy. Tanks rolling through the streets, soldiers mowing down hordes of undead, the military instantly restoring order. But in reality, the military has already admitted that a zombie outbreak would be catastrophic. Cities would fall within days. Supply chains would collapse. Survivors would be scattered, outnumbered, and unarmed. Even special forces, the most trained combat experts in the world, would be overwhelmed by a relentless, mindless horde. No fear, no pain, no stopping them unless you destroy the brain. And if the infection spreads fast enough, the military could be wiped out before they even have a chance to fight back. So, why plan for zombies? Maybe it's just a military thought experiment. Or maybe the Pentagon wanted to prepare for something they couldn't say out loud. A virus that could make people violent, uncontrollable, and unstoppable. A neurological disease that turns people into mindless husks. A bioweapon that could wipe out civilization in weeks. Plan 8008 may be about zombies, but the threat it prepares for, that's all too real. What if the next world war wasn't fought with guns or bombs, but with a virus that turns people into mindless, raging monsters? The terrifying reality of weaponized disease. For centuries, nations have used biological warfare to wipe out enemies. But what if someone engineered a virus so powerful it didn't just kill? It turned people into mindless, violent husks, spreading chaos with every bite. Think it's just science fiction. History says otherwise. Weaponized diseases in human history. Biological warfare isn't new. Governments and militaries have been creating, modifying, and releasing deadly diseases for centuries. Some of the earliest recorded cases: the 1346 the Black Death as a weapon. Mongol warriors catapulted plague, infected corpses over city walls. The disease spread, wiping out entire populations. It may have helped trigger the deadliest pandemic in human history, 1700 smallpox, as a bioweapon. British forces gave Native Americans blankets infected with smallpox. Entire tribes were wiped out without a single shot being fired. World War II, Japan's deadly experiments. Unit 731, a secret Japanese program, infected prisoners with diseases like anthrax and bubonic plague. They even released plague-infected fleas over enemy territories. Cold War, the rise of bioweapon research. The US and the Soviet Union stockpiled anthrax, Ebola, and other lethal viruses. Both nations feared an attack using engineered diseases. And now, with modern technology, scientists aren't just studying deadly viruses, they're modifying them. Could a zombie virus be engineered? Let's break it down. For a virus to create zombie-like symptoms, it would need to destroy higher brain functions. Victims lose rational thought but retain basic movement. Real example: prions destroy brain tissue, causing aggression and mindless behavior. Trigger extreme aggression. Infected individuals attack others without hesitation. Real example: rabies alters brain chemistry, making animals hyper-aggressive. Spread rapidly through bites or fluids. The easier it spreads, the faster the outbreak grows. Real example: Ebola spreads through bodily fluids and is nearly unstoppable without strict quarantine. Keep the body moving after death. A virus that prevents decomposition, keeping hosts alive just long enough to spread. Real example: some parasites control their hosts even after their brains stop functioning. Now, imagine if scientists combined these traits into a single virus. Could it happen? Some experts believe it already has. Declassified bioweapon projects that sound like zombie outbreaks. Project Kosa, South Africa, 1980s. A secret program aimed at developing race-specific bioweapons. Scientists worked on viruses that could alter behavior or cause uncontrollable aggression. One goal: a disease that would turn enemy populations against each other. Soviet bioweapon research, Cold War era. The Soviet Union created weaponized smallpox, anthrax, and hemorrhagic fevers. Some reports claim they experimented with rabies-based hybrids. Could they have been working on a rage-inducing supervirus? DARPA's brain control research in modern day. The U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency is working on brain-altering technology. Projects involve controlling emotions, erasing fear, and inducing aggression. Could this research accidentally create a real zombie-like condition? If a bioweapon like this was ever released, it wouldn't be a war between nations. It would be a war for survival, the ethical nightmare of a zombie bioweapon. Even if scientists could create a zombie virus, would they? Would a government ever unleash a virus that creates mindless, aggressive killers? Would they use it to wipe out enemy forces, then struggle to contain it? Would they ever admit if they had already tested it? Some theorists believe classified experiments have already happened, in remote areas, in secret labs, with victims that never got the chance to speak. If the goal was total domination without nuclear fallout, a zombie virus might be the perfect weapon. No infrastructure destroyed, no radiation contamination, just a world overrun by mindless, infected killers. What would happen if a zombie bioweapon was released? Day 1. First outbreak reports. News of a mysterious new disease spreading rapidly. Government officials assure the public it's under control. Hospitals overrun with aggressive, uncontrollable patients. Date 3. Cities begin to collapse. Infected individuals attack others on sight. Emergency services fail to contain the outbreak. Mass panic erupts as military units go silent. Day 7. Martial law and evacuations. Governments enforce quarantine zones and travel bans. Civilians either flee or fight for survival. The infected now outnumber the living. Day 14. Total global breakdown. The virus spreads faster than it can be stopped. Entire cities abandoned or burned to the ground. The world enters a new dark age, ruled by the infected. Can really take that risk? Or has someone, somewhere, already created a virus like this and is waiting for the right moment? Why do some cultures fear spirits while others fear the walking dead? The answer lies in ancient traditions, death rituals, and the way we understand the afterlife, in zombies, spirits, and the fear of the dead. No matter where you go in the world, one fear remains the same, the fear of the dead returning. But how different cultures interpret that fear, that's where things get interesting. In some places, the undead are mindless, rotting corpses. In others, they are vengeful spirits seeking revenge, and in a few, they are both. The three global categories of the undead. Throughout history, different cultures have viewed the undead in three primary ways. The possessed body, a reanimated corpse, often controlled by a curse, magic, or disease. Example, the Haitian Vodou zombie, the fear, losing control of your own body. The restless spirit, a soul that refuses to move on, haunting the living. Example, Chinese hungry ghosts, the fear, unfinished business and vengeance. The plague of the undead, a contagious, mindless horde spreading death. Example, European revenants, the fear, a mass outbreak that cannot be stopped. Why these differences? It all comes down to how different societies view death. African and Caribbean, zombies as slaves, not monsters. In Haitian Vodou, zombies aren't flesh-eating monsters. They are people who have lost their free will. The origin of the Vodou zombie. Rooted in the horrors of slavery, the zombie represents a fate worse than death. Enslaved people feared dying and being brought back as mindless workers. The Raugr, Vodou sorcerers, were believed to control the dead, turning them into obedient servants. The real horror. Even in death, you might never be free. This idea made its way to Western horror, but with a twist. Early zombie films still showed them as slaves. Modern zombies became flesh-eating monsters. The fear shifted from losing free will to losing humanity entirely. China, fear of spirits, not bodies. Unlike Western zombie myths, Chinese horror focuses on spirits, not rotting corpses. Why? Because in Chinese culture, the dead must be honored. If a person dies without proper burial rituals, their soul cannot rest. The Hungry Ghost Festival, Ghost Month. Every year, during Ghost Month, spirits roam the earth. Families offer food and gifts to appease them. If ignored, the ghosts become vengeful. Jiangshi, the hopping undead. Unlike Western zombies, Jiangshi don't shamble, they hop. They suck life energy, not flesh. Their fearsome reputation comes from not receiving proper burial rites. The fear here isn't about infection or a zombie apocalypse. It's about what happens when the dead are forgotten. Europe, the plague and the fear of walking corpses. Medieval Europe saw death constantly. The Black Death wiped out nearly 50% of Europe. Mass graves were filled with bodies, sometimes still moving. Superstition spread. Were these people really dead? The birth of revenants. In medieval Europe, revenants were the walking dead. Decayed but still moving. They were brainless. They came back to kill those who wronged them. Villagers feared that plague victims would rise from their graves. Unlike Vodou zombies, these undead weren't controlled by others. Unlike Jiangshi, they didn't drain life force. They were relentless, rotting monsters fueled by hate. This directly influenced modern zombie horror. South America, shapers, shifters, and soul stealers. Across South America, many undead legends aren't mindless creatures. They are shapeshifters. The Pishtaco Andean flesh eaters. a white-skinned demon that feeds on the fat of humans. Many believe it was inspired by European colonizers who killed indigenous people, the fear. The undead don't just kill, they consume. The so-called Caribbean blood-suckers. By day, an old woman. By night, she sheds her skin and drinks blood. If she steals too much, her victims waste away, becoming undead themselves. Here, the fear isn't just the dead coming back, it's that anyone, friend or family, could already be one of them. The Middle East, spirits, not bodies. In the Middle East, undead horror doesn't involve rotting corpses. Instead, jinn and spirits haunt the living. The jewel of the flesh, eating demon, an ancient shape-shifting spirit that lures victims, feeds on corpses in graveyards and deserts. Sometimes, a gull isn't a demon, but a human cursed for their sins. The nastiness half a body, still dangerous, a creature split in half, one arm, one leg, half a face. Despite its missing parts, it can move faster than any human. A direct inspiration for modern complete zombies. In these myths, the undead aren't mindless. They are calculating, tricking humans into their doom. The modern shift, a global zombie myth. Thanks to movies, games, and the internet, the zombie has evolved. The Western undead flesh-eating zombies have mixed with Asian spirits, African Vodou lore, and Middle Eastern demons. Now we see fast zombies, cursed zombies, infection-based zombies. The fear of the undead isn't just cultural anymore. It's global. Because no matter where you're from, the dead aren't supposed to return. But when they do, the real horror begins. Every zombie story has one thing in common. It's never just about the undead. It's about us. About society crumbling. Why do zombies always appear in times of crisis? It's not a coincidence. Every time the world feels like it's on the edge of collapse, zombie stories rise from the grave. Why? Because zombies don't just eat people. They represent everything we fear losing. Economic collapse. Government failure. Social breakdown. A world where we turn against each other. It's not the undead we're afraid of. It's surviving in a world where nothing works anymore. How the Great Depression created the first modern zombies. The 1930s White Zombie, the first zombie film, released during the Great Depression. A story about people being turned into mindless slaves. Why was this terrifying? Because people had already lost everything. Their jobs, their homes, their future. And what's worse than losing control of your life? Losing control of your body. The fear of becoming a soulless, obedient zombie reflected the real fear of being a slave to a broken system. The 1960s. Night of the Living Dead, the death of trust. The Game Changer. Night of the Living Dead. America was in chaos. The Vietnam War. The Civil Rights Movement. The assassinations of MLK and JFK. Suddenly, a new kind of zombie appeared. Mindless. Relentless, endless. But the real horror, people refusing to work together. The government doesn't save anyone. The military doesn't stop the outbreak. And worst of all, humans are more dangerous than zombies. By the end of the movie, it's not the zombies that kill the last survivor. It's the police. A direct reflection of society's mistrust in authority, the 1970s and 80s, consumerism in the Walking Dead society. Dawn of the Dead, zombies in a shopping mall. Why a mall? Because zombies means mindless consumers. The movie's message, society has already collapsed. People don't think, they just consume. The fear, are we already zombies? The 1980s, the birth of fast zombies. As capitalism and greed took over, zombies got faster, stronger, harder to escape. The rage-infected undead started appearing in fiction. Why? Because life was speeding up. No longer was it about slow decay. It was about sudden, violent collapse. The 1990s economic collapse and the rise of survival horror. The 1990s brought a new kind of fear, job markets crashing, fear of new diseases, technology making people feel more isolated. Zombies reflected a new kind of paranoia, Resident Evil and the corporate apocalypse. Instead of voodoo or magic, zombies came from corporations. The Umbrella Corporation didn't just create zombies, they profited from them. The fear What if the people in charge are the real monsters? 28 days later, the first fast, zombie apocalypse. Released after 9/11, the world felt like it could end overnight. Instead of a slow infection, the virus spreads in seconds. The fear shifted from slow societal decay to instant collapse. The 2000s, post-9/11 globalization, and The Walking Dead, the 2000s brought terrorism, wars over oil, the 2008 financial crash, and suddenly zombies were everywhere. World War Z, the zombie as a global threat, a zombie outbreak, but treated like a real world pandemic. Governments ignore the warnings. The world falls into chaos. The Walking Dead, a story about survival after the fall of civilization. But more than that, it's about people losing their humanity. What's worse, the zombies or each other? The 2020s, real pandemics, conspiracies, and society on edge. Then it happened for real. The world shut down. Stores emptied. The streets went quiet. People turned on each other. For the first time, zombie fiction didn't feel like fiction anymore. Why? The Last of Us feels so real. A fungus-based infection takes over the world. But the real horror, how quickly society collapses. Governments bombing their own people. Survivors turning into warlords. Cult leaders and cannibals. The message, it's not the infection that destroys us. It's what we do to each other. Why we love zombie survival fantasies. Why do people fantasize about zombie survival? Why do so many people joke about having a plan for the apocalypse? Because zombie fiction lets us imagine a world where the rules don't matter anymore. No more debt. No more social classes. No more bosses. No more bills. It's terrifying, but also freeing. That's why zombies are always popular during economic crashes. That's why survival horror explodes when people feel powerless. Because deep down, we want to believe we'd be the ones who make it. The ultimate truth about zombie fiction. Zombies aren't just horror. They are a reflection of us. In the 1930s, they represented slavery and economic ruin. In the 1960s, they reflected civil unrest and mistrust in authority. In the 2000s, they symbolized global fear of collapse. And today, they represent something even more terrifying, a world where people stop caring about each other. And the real horror, we might already be living in it. It started as fiction, but now governments, corporations, and survivalists are treating zombies as a real threat. The question is, why? Zombies aren't real, so why are we preparing for them? If zombies are just fiction, then why do we keep preparing for them? The US government has a real zombie survival plan. Major corporations use zombie outbreaks for emergency training. Survivalists use zombie apocalypse scenarios to train for real disasters. What if zombie preparedness isn't just a joke? What if it's a way to prepare for something else? Why big corporations use zombie scenarios for emergency training? It's not just the government. Major corporations run zombie drills too. Amazon's warehouse training. What if it's the zombie apocalypse? Employees are trained to secure supply chains in an emergency. The zombie theme makes training engaging, but the lesson is real. They're actually preparing for economic crashes and supply chain failures. Walmart's zombie disaster plans. Walmart has its own emergency response team. They train employees using zombie survival strategies. Why? Because if a real disaster happens, Walmart stores become survival hubs. Again, this isn't really about zombies. It's about preparing for mass panic and total system failure. How preppers use zombie fiction to train for real survival. The survivalist community has a phrase, prepare for zombies, survive anything. What does that mean? If you train for a zombie apocalypse, you're actually preparing for power grid failures. Food and water shortages, government collapse, mass panic and civil unrest. Why survivalists love zombie fiction. It teaches real survival skills in an entertaining way. It shows what happens when society collapses. It makes people think about escape plans and supplies. Even FEMA, a federal emergency management agency, uses zombie-themed training for disaster response teams. Why? Because people take survival training more seriously when it's fun. The blurred line between entertainment and real survival. The more we obsess over zombie survival, the more it starts to feel real. The CDC Centers for Disease Control launched a zombie survival guide. Gun manufacturers sell zombie edition survival weapons. Preppers host zombie survival boot camps. The Walking Dead effect. After The Walking Dead exploded in popularity, real survival gear sales skyrocketed. People actually built bunkers, stockpiled food, and bought weapons. At some point, preparing for zombies became preparing for real disasters. And that raises a terrifying question. Are we training for something we secretly believe is coming? How the pandemic proved zombie survivalists were right. Then 2020 happened. A global pandemic. Supply chain failures. Mass panic and paranoia. And suddenly, the people who joked about zombie survival were the most prepared. They already had emergency food supplies. They knew how to stay isolated and self-sufficient. They weren't panic. They were ready. What once seemed paranoid became practical. And that's why zombie survival culture isn't going anywhere. It's not about monsters. It's about being ready when the world falls apart. The ultimate truth about zombie preparedness. Zombies are fiction, but the fears behind them are real. Governments, corporations, and survivalists don't prepare for zombies because they think they'll happen. They prepare because something like it already has. And will again. Pandemics, wars, economic crashes, total government failure. Zombies are just a mask. What we're really afraid of is losing control. From terrifying nightmares to blockbuster franchises, how did zombies go from folklore horror to pop culture icons? How zombies took over pop culture. Zombies weren't always mainstream. For centuries, they were a quiet, creeping fear, buried in folklore, whispered in dark legends. Then suddenly, they exploded into pop culture. They became a billion-dollar industry. They turned from slow, rotting monsters into fast-paced action horror. But why? How did zombies evolve from shambling nightmares to one of the biggest horror icons in history? Let's go back to where it all started. The first zombie stories in fiction. Before movies, before video games, zombies first invaded literature, 1929. The Magic Island, the first Western book to mention Vodou zombies, 1954. I Am Legend, a novel that introduced the idea of a global outbreak, 1959. The Walking Dead, a short story, an early tale of mindless undead swarming a city. But it wasn't until film that zombies really became legendary. The game changer, Night of the Living Dead, then came George A. Romero. In 1968, he released Night of the Living Dead, and nothing was ever the same. Before Romero, zombies were mind-controlled slaves. After Romero, zombies were flesh-eating, contagious monsters. Suddenly, zombies were no longer just folklore. They were mindless hordes that spread like a virus, a metaphor for social collapse, the perfect symbol for fear of the unknown. Romero's film changed horror forever, and it was just the beginning. Zombies weren't just horror monsters anymore. They were apocalyptic survival challenges, video game enemies, blockbuster action movie villains. By 2010, zombies had reached peak popularity. But there was one big question. Would the zombie craze ever die? Why zombies refuse to fade away? Every horror trend eventually dies. Vampires faded after Twilight. Alien horror slowed down after the 90s. Slashers had their golden age but disappeared, but zombies, they keep coming back. Why? Reason 1, zombies evolve. Zombies changed over time. Fast zombies, smart zombies, viral zombies, alien zombies. The genre reinvents itself every decade. Reason 2, zombies are a blank slate. They can represent any fear. Plague, war, social collapse, consumerism, paranoia. Every era reshapes zombies into new nightmares. Reason 3, the zombie survival fantasy. People love imagining how they'd survive. Preppers use zombie fiction as real survival training. Zombies create an exciting what-if apocalypse scenario. Zombies aren't just a monster. They're a mirror of our fears. And that's why they never stay buried in the future. Zombies are heading into more psychological horror focusing on human survival. More sci-fi horror mixing zombies with AI and cyberpunk. More global perspectives exploring zombie myths from different cultures. Zombies will never die. They'll just keep evolving. Zombies aren't just horror anymore. They're a symbol of survival, a metaphor for real-world fears, a permanent part of pop culture history. From folklore to Hollywood, from horror to action, zombies have taken over. And as long as we fear the unknown survival and the end of the world, the undead will always return. We've seen it in movies, played it in games, and imagined it in stories. But what if zombies were real? Would humanity fall or adapt? Would a zombie outbreak mean the end of civilization? We've seen it 1,000 times. Cities overrun. Society collapses overnight. Survivors forced to fight for every scrap of food. But is that really how it would happen? If zombies were real, would humanity actually fall? Or would we adapt, turning the undead into just another part of life? Let's break it down. The first 24 hours, chaos and panic. The outbreak begins. At first, no one believes it. News reports sound confused, calling it riots, mass hysteria, or a strange disease. Social media is flooded with fake videos. Nobody knows what's real. Hospitals are overrun with bitten victims acting violently. Then the first major government announcement drops: travel bans, national emergency, stay inside, avoid contact with the infected. By this point, panic has already set in. Highways jammed with people trying to escape, stores looted for food and supplies, police and military overwhelmed. For the first day, things spiral out of control. But is this really the end? Or just a very bad day? Will the military win against zombies? A lot of zombie stories ignore one thing. Modern militaries are designed for overwhelming force. Thermal imaging would spot zombies instantly. Drones would track their movements. Tanks and helicopters would cut through massive hordes. Zombies might be terrifying in close quarters, but against the full power of a military, they wouldn't last long. Police and SWAT teams would hold cities. The military would set up quarantine zones. Scientists would analyze the infection and look for a cure. Would there be chaos? Yes. Would we lose some cities? Probably. But total extinction? Not likely. Survival of the fittest. How would humanity adapt? Now, let's say zombies aren't wiped out immediately. Let's say they linger. Would that mean the end of the world? Or would life simply change? If zombies became a long-term threat, humans would adapt. Safe cities, fortified zones where life continues as normal. Walled settlements, small, self-sustaining towns like medieval castles. Automated defenses, drones, robots, and AI controlling security. Zombie farming. Some might even find ways to control or exploit the undead. Instead of a total collapse, society might evolve into something new. A world where kids grow up learning how to avoid zombies. Jobs exist to clean out infected zones. Technology advances to counter the undead. It wouldn't be the end of humanity. It would just be a different world. The psychological horror of a zombie world. But even if humans survive, would we mentally handle it? Seeing loved ones turn into monsters, knowing death isn't the end, it's just the beginning of something worse. The constant fear of infection, with no way to fully cure it. In a long-term zombie world, people might become numb to death. Mental health issues would skyrocket. Some might turn to dangerous experiments to fix the undead. A world where zombies exist wouldn't just be physically dangerous. It would be a psychological nightmare. The ethics of a zombie-infested world. If zombies were real, humanity would face a new moral crisis. Do we try to cure them or kill them? What happens to infected people who haven't turned yet? Should zombies have rights? If they still show signs of humanity? And the biggest ethical question of all, would humanity become the real monsters, killing the infected without remorse, survivor groups turning against each other, governments using the undead for experiments or warfare? If the world didn't collapse immediately, would it slowly fall apart anyway? Would humans become just as brutal as the undead? Or would we find a way to stay human? Could we live in a world with zombies? If zombies were real, the world wouldn't just end overnight. We would fight back. We would adapt. we would survive. But it wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't just be about killing zombies. It would be about staying sane in a world where death doesn't mean peace, making impossible ethical choices, rebuilding society while fighting the undead. A zombie world wouldn't mean extinction. It would mean a new way of life. Would you be ready for it? Zombies have lurched through books, movies, and video games for decades. But with new technology, are we about to witness the next evolution of undead horror? Are zombies losing their bitey or just evolving? For decades, zombies have been unstoppable, shuffling through classic horror films, terrifying gamers in survival horror, taking over mainstream pop culture. But lately something has changed. Audiences aren't as scared anymore. Zombie stories are feeling repetitive. Gamers have fought the undead in every way possible. So what's next? Is zombie fiction dying, or is it about to be reborn? The future of zombie movies. Will we ever get a perfect one? Despite all the zombie films we've seen, has there ever been a truly perfect one? A movie that feels 100% real. A film that shows a realistic outbreak with accurate science, depicts real military and societal responses, avoids cliches and predictable tropes. Many films get close, but they always hold back. Would we ever get a zombie movie so real it feels like it could actually happen? And if we did, would we even want to watch it? Or would it be too real? No matter how many times we watch the dead rise, we always come back for more. But why? Why do we love zombies? The primal fear that keeps zombies alive. It doesn't matter how much time passes. Zombies always return. Every decade brings new undead stories. Every form of media reinvents them, and somehow we never get tired of them. Why? Why are we so obsessed with the end of the world? Why do we love stories about the fall of civilization? And why, after all this time, do zombies still scare us? Zombies and the fear of losing control. The undead are terrifying for one simple reason. They take away what makes us human. Think about it, no thoughts, no emotions, only hunger. That's what makes them scarier than any monster. Vampires. They're still intelligent. We're wolves. They can change back. Ghosts. They were once just like us. But zombies. Zombies are us, but without a soul. And that's a fear as old as humanity itself. Why do we keep coming back to zombie stories? Zombies aren't just horror. They're escapism. When the world feels chaotic, we imagine it collapsing. When life feels complicated, we dream of survival. When society feels overwhelming, we wonder what happens after society. Zombies give us an excuse to break free. No more bills, no more emails, no more daily routines, just survival. It's terrifying, but it's also freeing. That's why we never stop loving zombies. Because deep down we all wonder, what if everything just ended? The paradox of finding comfort in the apocalypse. It sounds insane, right? Why would anyone find comfort in zombies? But here's the truth. Zombie fiction isn't really about death. It's about starting over. A world wiped clean. A life stripped down to survival. Humanity rebuilding from nothing. Zombies let us imagine a world where there's no more stress. Life is simple again. Every day is about survival, not schedules. The apocalypse isn't just horror. For some, it's wish fulfillment. Not because we want destruction, but because we want to start fresh. Zombies reflect our biggest fears. Every zombie story is about something deeper. Look at how the undead have changed over time. Romero zombies. Fear of societal breakdown. Consumerism turned people into mindless hordes. Virus-based zombies fear of pandemics. Now, zombies represent technology over population. In control, zombies evolve with us. They change as we change. And that's why we never stop telling these stories. Because zombies aren't just horror. They're a reflection of us. The final question, will we ever stop loving zombies? Think about this. For hundreds of years, humans have feared the undead. From medieval Revenants to Haitian Vodou zombies to Hollywood's fast-moving infected. And no matter how many times we kill them, They always come back. So will zombies ever die out in pop culture? Probably not. Because as long as humans fear the unknown, as long as we fear losing control, as long as we dream about survival, zombies will always be there. Waiting, watching, and rising again. Final thought, zombies are forever. The world will change. Horror will evolve. But zombies, they never stay buried. And no matter how many times we see them, we'll always come back. Because deep down we know that, if the world ever really fell apart, we'd be ready. Or at least, we hope we would. Zombies aren't going anywhere, and neither are we. Subscribe, and let's keep exploring the undead together.